The third man factor. There is a phenomenon that defies explanation, a mystery woven into the fabric of survival itself. It has been whispered about by mountaineers lost in the death zone, by shipwrecked sailors adrift at sea, by explorers on the brink of collapse in the most unforgiving places on Earth. When faced with the abyss, when death is just moments away, many survivors report the same eerie experience, an unseen presence, a guiding force that appears out of nowhere, pushing them forward, whispering instructions, offering comfort. It is as if an invisible guardian walks beside them, keeping them alive when all hope is lost. This is known as the third man factor, and it is one of the most chilling and mysterious survival phenomena ever recorded. The stories are hauntingly similar. A lone explorer, trapped in a frozen wasteland, unable to go on, a lost hiker, dehydrated and delirious, collapsing under the weight of exhaustion, a shipwrecked sailor, drifting in endless ocean, resigned to his fate. And then, something changes. A presence appears. Not a hallucination, not a ghost, but something different. Something that feels utterly real. They hear a voice, feel a reassuring hand on their shoulder, sense a shadow walking just behind them. This unseen companion encourages them to move forward, to hold on just a little longer, to survive. One of the most famous accounts of the third man factor comes from Sir Ernest Shackleton, the legendary Antarctic explorer. In 1916, after his ship, the Endurance, was crushed by ice, Shackleton and his crew were stranded in the frozen wilderness of Antarctica. He and two companions set out on a desperate 36-hour trek across glaciers and mountains to reach a whaling station that could save their stranded crew. And during that journey, Shackleton later recalled something strange. He felt the presence of a fourth person walking alongside them. He never saw this figure, never spoke to it, but he knew beyond doubt that it was there. Years later, his companions would admit that they too had sensed it. This phenomenon is not limited to Shackleton's journey. In 1933, British mountaineer Frank Smythe came within a few hundred meters of reaching the summit of Everest alone. As he struggled against exhaustion, he became convinced that he was not alone. He even went so far as to break off a piece of his food and offer it to his unseen companion before realizing that no one was there. The third man factor has been reported by survivors of plane crashes, deep sea divers trapped beneath the waves, astronauts floating in the void of space. When humans reach their absolute breaking point, when the body and mind are about to give up, something intervenes, something that should not be there. But what is it? Is it a hallucination, a trick of the mind caused by stress and deprivation? Or is it something more? Some researchers believe that the third man factor is a survival mechanism deeply embedded in our brains. When facing extreme stress and isolation, the mind may generate a companion as a psychological defense, a way to push forward when all other instincts scream to stop. It is as if evolution has given us an emergency switch, a hidden presence that activates only in moments of ultimate crisis. Others believe that it is something beyond psychology. Religious and spiritual interpretations of the third man factor suggest that these figures are guardian angels, spirits sent to protect those in danger. Many survivors describe a sense of overwhelming peace when encountering the third man, a feeling of being watched over by something greater than themselves. But what makes the third man factor so eerie is that it is not like ordinary hallucinations. Normal hallucinations are disjointed, chaotic, and terrifying. The third man, on the other hand, is calm, purposeful, and consistent. It does not confuse, it guides. It does not frighten, it reassures. It does not demand, it encourages. Some of the most extreme cases have pushed this mystery even further. In 1985, Joe Simpson and his climbing partner Simon Yates attempted to summit Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes. After an accident left Simpson with a shattered leg, he was left for dead in the ice, falling into a deep crevasse. He should not have survived, but as he crawled back toward safety, suffering from unimaginable pain and exhaustion, something happened. He was not alone. Simpson later described feeling an overwhelming certainty that a presence was guiding him, keeping him moving, telling him where to go. That presence saved his life. These experiences are not just stories, they are patterns. Across time, across cultures, across countless survival situations, the third man factor appears again and again. Science struggles to explain it fully, yet it continues to happen. Even today, when researchers interview modern-day survivors of extreme situations, they still report this phenomenon. It is real, it is persistent, and it raises questions that we may never fully answer. Is it the mind's last line of defense against death? A neurological trick that helps us endure the unendurable? Or is it something else entirely? Something beyond human understanding? One thing is certain, those who have experienced it do not doubt its reality, and for many of them, the third man is the only reason they are still alive to tell their stories. The McCollough Effect. Imagine looking at a simple black and white pattern and realizing that something is wrong. The lines, which should be neutral, now seem tinged with color. It's subtle at first, a faint red or green creeping along the edges. You blink, rub your eyes, and even look away for a moment. But when you return to the pattern, the colors persist. Days pass, maybe even weeks, and still your vision refuses to return to normal. What if I told you that all of this happened because you stared at colored stripes for just a few minutes? This is the eerie, almost hypnotic power of the McCollough Effect, a bizarre optical illusion that can fundamentally alter how your brain perceives black and white images long after exposure. But how does it work? Why does it last so long? And could it be something far more unsettling than just a trick of the eyes? To understand this, we need to step into the world of visual adaptation. The McCollough Effect was first discovered in 1965 by Celeste McCollough, a psychologist fascinated by how the brain processes color and contrast. At its core, the illusion is a form of what scientists call contingent color after effects, a phenomenon where your eyes and brain adapt to repeated exposure to certain colors in specific orientations. The simplest way to trigger the effect is by staring at alternating black and white stripes, known as gratings, after first exposing yourself to similar patterns overlaid with specific colors. For example, if you look at a grid of vertical stripes that are red and black and a grid of horizontal stripes that are green and black for just a couple of minutes, something strange happens. After exposure, when you return to looking at simple black and white stripes, they no longer appear neutral. The vertical ones might take on a greenish hue, and the horizontal ones a reddish tint, even though no actual color is present. The truly unsettling part, unlike most optical illusions that disappear in seconds, the McCollough Effect can last for hours, days, or even weeks. Some rare cases have reported the effect persisting for months, leaving people questioning whether their vision has been permanently altered. But why does this illusion linger so long? What makes it so much more persistent than other color after effects, like the ones you get from staring at a bright light and then seeing its afterimage? The answer lies in how our brains process color at a fundamental level. Our visual system is constantly adapting to the environment. This is what allows us to maintain color constancy. So a white shirt still looks white whether you're under bright sunlight or dim indoor lighting. The McCollough Effect, however, exploits this adaptation process in an extreme way. Instead of merely adjusting to overall lighting conditions, the effect tricks the brain into forming an association between color and orientation. Essentially, your neural pathways responsible for processing color and contrast become recalibrated, believing that specific orientations should always be associated with specific hues. This is why the effect lasts far longer than traditional color afterimages. Typical afterimages occur in the retina, the layer of cells at the back of your eye. But the McCollough Effect is believed to occur at a much deeper level, somewhere within the visual cortex of the brain itself. In other words, this isn't just an optical trick, it's a reprogramming of how your brain interprets patterns. Now, here's where it gets even weirder. Unlike most illusions, the McCollough Effect doesn't simply fade away when you look at normal colors. You can't just reset your eyes by staring at a blank wall. In some cases, even sleeping doesn't immediately erase the effect. Some scientists believe this persistence is due to synaptic changes in the brain, meaning the neurons responsible for color processing have physically adjusted themselves. It's as if the brain has rewritten part of its code, and unlike a simple computer program, there's no easy way to undo it. What does this mean for those who experience it? For most people, the effect fades naturally over time, but in extreme cases, researchers have tested methods to reverse it. Theoretically, exposing yourself to the same pattern but with the colors reversed, so green for vertical and red for horizontal, could cancel out the illusion by reprogramming the brain again. However, this method is not foolproof. and in some cases people report their vision staying altered indefinitely. This brings us to an unsettling question. Could the McCollough effect be a form of brain hacking? Think about it. If simple exposure to colors and patterns can alter perception for weeks, what else could external stimuli be doing to our minds without us realizing it? Could advertising, social media, or even digital screens be subtly shaping the way we perceive the world in ways we don't fully understand? While there's no concrete evidence that the McCollough effect has been used for nefarious purposes, it does open the door to speculation. Some researchers have proposed that the effect could be a window into understanding how prolonged exposure to artificial light and screens affects the brain. Could modern technology be subtly rewiring our perception without us even knowing? We spend hours every day staring at high-contrast grids, bright screens, and artificial colors. Who's to say these visual experiences aren't shaping our perception in ways beyond our awareness? In the end, the McCollough effect remains one of the strangest, most persistent optical illusions ever discovered. It's a glitch in the way our brains process reality, revealing just how malleable and fragile our perception truly is. If a few minutes of colored stripes can alter how we see the world for weeks, what else in our environment might be doing the same thing? The next time you look at a simple black and white pattern, take a closer look. Are you really seeing it for what it is? Or has your mind already been reprogrammed in ways you never imagined? The doorway effect. Imagine this. You walk into a room, stop suddenly, and forget why you even came in. You stand there, confused, trying to retrace your steps, scanning your memory for the reason you entered. This isn't just forgetfulness. This is the doorway effect, a strange quirk of human cognition that affects all of us. And yet, we barely notice its significance. This phenomenon happens because our brains are wired for efficiency. They don't store every single detail indefinitely. Instead, they optimize, categorize, and, at times, delete information that is no longer relevant. Walking through a doorway is a psychological cue, a scene change in the grand movie of your life. And like a scene transition in a film, your brain treats it as a clean slate, wiping away short-term thoughts to make room for new information. But why does this happen? What causes the mind to reset itself so abruptly, simply because we passed through a door? It all comes down to how our memory works. There are different types of memory: short-term, long-term, and working memory. The working memory is where our immediate thoughts reside, the small, momentary details we use to complete tasks. It's fragile, easily disrupted, and constantly overwritten. Scientists have studied the doorway effect in controlled experiments. In one famous study, participants were given objects to remember and then asked to walk through a series of rooms. Shockingly, when they passed through a doorway, they were significantly more likely to forget what they were carrying in their minds compared to when they moved the same distance without crossing a threshold. The simple act of stepping into another room erased their memory of the object. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. This effect happens even in virtual reality. In experiments where people navigate digital environments, the same phenomenon occurs. Stepping through a virtual doorway makes the brain flush recent thoughts, even though no physical movement has actually taken place. This suggests that the doorway effect isn't just about physical location, but about how the brain processes transitions. This raises an unsettling question. What else are we forgetting without realizing it? If a simple doorway can erase something as minor as why we walked into a room, could other transitions in life be causing the same effect on a much larger scale? What about driving home and stepping out of the car, closing one app and opening another, even waking up in a new day? Think about it. How many times have you walked into a store, completely blanked on what you needed to buy, only to remember it later when you return home? It's as if walking back through the same door re-triggers the memory, pulling it from some hidden storage in your mind. But why would the brain do this? Wouldn't it be more useful to retain all our thoughts as we move through the world? Not necessarily. Our minds are predictive machines, constantly making decisions about what is relevant and what is not. When we enter a new environment, our brain prioritizes the present moment, assuming that what happened in the previous room is now less important. This helps us stay focused on the immediate surroundings, an evolutionary advantage that has helped us survive. Imagine our ancestors moving from a dense forest into an open field. The dangers and priorities shift immediately. The brain has to clear unnecessary thoughts from the last environment to stay alert to new threats. But in the modern world, this survival mechanism can work against us. We don't need to be hypervigilant in a safe home or an office setting, yet the same reset mechanism still activates, making us forget where we left our phone, what task we were in the middle of, or why we opened the fridge. There are ways to counteract the doorway effect, but they require conscious effort. Repeating the task out loud as you move can reinforce the memory. Holding an object related to the task, like a notepad or your phone, can act as an anchor, keeping the thought active in your mind. Or, simply stopping before crossing the threshold, taking a second to visualize what you were doing, can help retain the memory. But even knowing this, the doorway effect remains an unavoidable part of human cognition. It's a silent, invisible force, shaping the way we remember, or forget, our everyday lives. And it makes you wonder, how many thoughts, ideas, and moments have disappeared, erased in the blink of an eye, simply because we stepped through a doorway? Perhaps, in a way, each new room we enter is a fresh start, a place where the past fades and the present takes over. But if a simple doorway can do this, what about bigger transitions? Moving to a new city, changing jobs, starting over in life? Do these larger thresholds trigger an even more profound reset in our minds? The next time you step through a door and forget why you walked in, remember, your brain isn't failing you. It's simply turning the page, preparing for the next scene in the ever-changing movie of your existence. The Wason selection task, logical blindness. The Wason selection task is one of the most revealing experiments in psychology, a simple logic puzzle that exposes something unsettling about the way our minds work. It proves that despite our confidence in reasoning, despite our belief that we are rational beings, our brains are actually terrible at pure logic. We struggle with abstract reasoning. We make mistakes that seem obvious in hindsight. And what's even more shocking? The moment the same puzzle is framed as a social problem, we suddenly become experts at solving it. This isn't just a trick. It's a fundamental flaw in how human cognition operates. Imagine you are given a simple task. You are presented with 4 cards, each showing a number on one side and a letter on the other. The visible sides of the cards show an E, a K, a 4, and a 7. Now, here's the rule. If a card has a vowel on one side, then it must have an even number on the other. Your job is to test this rule by flipping over the minimum number of cards needed to confirm or disprove it. Most people, without hesitation, say they need to flip the E and the 4. This feels intuitive, but it's completely wrong. The correct answer is that you need to flip the E and the 7. The reason is simple. Flipping the E ensures that there's an even number on the other side, confirming the rule. But flipping the 7 is just as important, because if it has a vowel on the other side, it would disprove the rule. The 4 is irrelevant because the rule doesn't state that all even numbers must have vowels. It only sets a condition for vowels. This is where logical blindness comes in. The human brain isn't wired for abstract logic. Even highly intelligent people fail this test because logic in its pure form is not what our brains evolved for. We evolved to survive, to navigate a world filled with threats, to cooperate, and most importantly, to detect social cheaters, people who break the rules in ways that could harm us or our communities. And this is where the Wason selection task becomes truly disturbing. When the exact same puzzle is restructured as a social problem, suddenly, almost everyone gets it right. Imagine this scenario instead. You are a bouncer at a bar. Your job is to make sure no one under 21 is drinking alcohol. There are 4 people sitting at a table. One is drinking beer, one is drinking soda, one is 25 years old, and one is 17 years old. Which 2 people do you need to check? Almost everyone immediately sees the answer. You check the person drinking beer, and you check the 17-year-old. It's obvious. We don't even have to think about it for long. It's instinctual. But logically, this is the exact same puzzle as the card problem. The only thing that changed is the way it was framed. This exposes something profound about human cognition. We are not naturally logical creatures. We struggle with abstract reasoning, but we excel at detecting social rule breakers. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Early humans who could quickly recognize a liar, a thief, or someone who didn't contribute to the group were more likely to survive. Those who couldn't detect cheaters were exploited. Over thousands of generations, our brains became wired for social logic rather than mathematical or abstract reasoning. And yet, this flaw in our thinking affects everything, from politics to business to personal relationships. We believe we are making rational decisions when, in reality, our minds are riddled with biases. We make snap judgments, fall for logical fallacies, and struggle with pure reasoning unless it's connected to something we deeply understand on a human level. This is why propaganda works. This is why misinformation spreads. This is why even the smartest people can be easily manipulated. Take the justice system as an example. If crimes are framed in a way that triggers our instinct to detect cheaters, such as fraud, deception, or betrayal, we react with intense outrage and a demand for punishment. But if crimes are framed in ways that involve statistics, probabilities, or abstract risks, we struggle to process them emotionally. A single case of a person cheating on welfare can create more anger than knowing millions of people are suffering due to systemic problems. It's not that we don't care, it's that our brains aren't wired to respond rationally to numbers. This is also why conspiracy theories spread so easily. They are designed to exploit our natural instincts to detect cheaters and rule breakers. When people feel that powerful elites are secretly working against them, it ignites a deep psychological response, making them hyper-alert to perceived deception. This is why logical arguments rarely work against conspiratorial thinking. It's not about logic. It's about the way our minds frame information. Understanding the Wason selection task is not just about recognizing our logical weaknesses. It's about realizing that our perception of reality is shaped by biases we don't even notice. It's about questioning whether we are truly thinking rationally or just responding to instincts that have been programmed into us for thousands of years. But here's the most important part. Just because our brains have this flaw doesn't mean we are doomed to be irrational forever. The first step to overcoming this bias is awareness. Once we recognize that we are naturally bad at pure logic, we can start training ourselves to think differently. We can challenge our assumptions, analyze problems more carefully, and be more skeptical of emotional reasoning. And perhaps, most importantly, we can use this knowledge to navigate the modern world more intelligently. When we understand how and why our minds are tricked, we become harder to manipulate. We become more resistant to misinformation. We become better thinkers, better decision makers, and ultimately, more in control of our own minds. So the next time you are faced with a problem, ask yourself, am I truly thinking logically? Or am I simply following an instinct that was never designed for the complexity of the world we live in today? The answer might just change the way you see everything. The Capgras Delusion. Imagine waking up one day looking at your mother, your father, your spouse, people you've known your entire life, and feeling a creeping, overwhelming certainty that something is deeply wrong. They look the same, they sound the same, they act the same, but you just know these are not your loved ones. They are imposters, perfect replicas, mimicking every little detail, but completely and utterly fake. No one believes you. They try to convince you otherwise, telling you that everything is normal, that nothing has changed. But the more they insist, the more certain you become that they are lying, that they are part of something much larger, something sinister. You become desperate, terrified, feeling trapped in a reality that has been swapped out for something artificial. This is not the plot of a science fiction film or a psychological thriller. This is real. This is Capgras Delusion, a rare and deeply unsettling disorder, where a person becomes convinced that their loved ones have been replaced by identical imposters. And the implications of this bizarre psychological phenomenon go far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. It's a terrifying glitch in the human brain, one that challenges the very fabric of perception, memory, and reality itself. To understand how this happens, we have to delve into the mechanics of human recognition. Normally, when you see someone familiar, two things happen simultaneously. First, your visual cortex, the part of your brain responsible for processing faces, recognizes the person. Second, another pathway, the limbic system, which governs emotions, attaches the correct emotional response to that recognition. This is why, when you see your mother, you don't just recognize her physically, you feel something, a sense of connection, warmth, familiarity. But in people suffering from Capgras delusion, something in this system malfunctions. The connection between facial recognition and emotional familiarity is severed. The person still recognizes the face. Logically, they know who they are looking at. But the deep emotional feeling of familiarity is missing. And this missing emotional response creates a horrifying gap in perception, a contradiction so strong that the brain has no choice but to invent an explanation. These people must be imposters. The mind cannot accept that something is wrong with itself, so instead, it rewrites reality. Capgras delusion is often associated with brain injuries, strokes, or neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. It is also seen in some cases of schizophrenia, particularly in individuals who experience severe paranoia. But what makes it so terrifying is not just its effects, but what it suggests about all of us. Think about it. If our perception of reality depends on a delicate neural connection between recognition and emotion, then what happens when that connection is disrupted? How much of what we think we know is simply our brain filling in the gaps? One of the most disturbing cases of Capgras delusion was a man who, after a car accident, became convinced that his parents had been replaced by identical strangers. No matter what they said or did, he was certain they were fakes. But here's where it gets even stranger. When his parents called him on the phone, he recognized them instantly. Over the phone, the emotional recognition returned, but as soon as he saw them in person, the delusion took hold again. This suggests that the brain processes visual recognition and auditory recognition differently, each relying on separate pathways to create the full picture of a person's identity. This case also hints at a possible explanation for why Capgras delusion exists in the first place. Some neuroscientists believe it's related to prosopagnosia, or face blindness, a condition where people cannot recognize faces at all. But while prosopagnosia is a problem of recognition, Capgras is a problem of trust. It's as if the emotional part of the brain is screaming, "This is wrong," while the logical part is still registering familiar features. But if the person in front of you looks, sounds, and acts exactly like your loved one, and yet you feel no emotional connection to them, what conclusion is your brain left with? The only answer that makes sense to the Capgras sufferer is that they have been replaced. Now, imagine what this means on a philosophical level. If our experience of love, trust, and connection is built on neural signals, then what does that say about identity itself? Are our relationships just patterns of recognition and emotional feedback loops? If something as simple as a brain injury can erase the feeling of knowing someone, does that mean our entire sense of self, our understanding of those we love, is just a fragile construction of neurons? And here's an even darker thought. Could Capgras delusion be a glimpse into a deeper truth? What if, for those suffering from it, they're actually seeing something the rest of us are blind to? What if their brain is detecting a shift in reality that the rest of us are conditioned to ignore? What if, instead of a disorder, it's a perception we don't understand yet? Of course, from a medical standpoint, Capgras is considered a neurological and psychological phenomenon, not evidence of an alternate reality, but the eerie feeling it leaves behind lingers. Treating Capgras delusion is incredibly difficult because the person is certain of their belief. Logical arguments don't work. No amount of reasoning can convince them otherwise, because their delusion is built on what they feel, not what they know. And feelings are far more powerful than facts. In some cases, antipsychotic medications and cognitive behavioral therapy can help lessen the delusion, but there is no guaranteed cure. Some patients improve over time, while others remain trapped in their terrifying certainty that the people they love most have been replaced. So the next time you look into the face of someone you love, take a moment to think about what's really happening. Your brain is reconstructing them, matching their image to stored memories, attaching an emotional response, and making you feel that familiar connection. But what if one day that emotional link just stopped? Would you trust what you know? Or would you believe the feeling that something was horribly, horribly wrong? Because if there's one thing Capgras delusion teaches us, it's that our reality is only as stable as our minds allow it to be. And once that stability is shattered, there's no telling what we might start to see. False memories. Imagine being absolutely certain about a memory. Vivid, detailed, something you could swear happened. But what if that memory never existed? What if your mind had betrayed you, constructing a past that was nothing more than a carefully woven illusion? This is the unsettling reality of false memories, a phenomenon that proves our minds are not the perfect recorders of truth we believe them to be. Instead, they are fragile, malleable, and alarmingly easy to manipulate. False memories occur when people recall events that never actually happened, or remember details of real events that have been distorted, altered, or completely fabricated. And what makes this so terrifying is that false memories feel just as real as true ones. The confidence we place in our recollections doesn't determine their accuracy. In fact, research has shown that even the most vivid, emotionally charged memories can be entirely false. One of the most famous studies on false memories comes from cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, whose research has changed everything we thought we knew about memory. In one experiment, she and her colleagues successfully implanted completely fake childhood memories into participants' minds. These individuals, with no history of the event in question, were told a fabricated story about how they had once been lost in a shopping mall as a child. With just a few leading suggestions, many participants started filling in details that never happened, vividly describing how they felt, what they saw, and even who helped them. But this isn't just a laboratory experiment. False memories have had real-world consequences, with some of the most disturbing examples found in the justice system. Imagine a witness to a crime, standing in court, pointing to an innocent person, believing with absolute certainty that they are the culprit. This has happened countless times, leading to wrongful convictions, ruined lives, and irreversible damage, all because human memory is not the reliable archive we think it is. One of the most tragic cases involved Ronald Cotton, a man who was falsely accused and convicted of rape in 1984, based solely on eyewitness testimony. The victim, Jennifer Thompson, was absolutely convinced that Cotton was her attacker. But after 11 years in prison, DNA evidence proved his innocence. What's most chilling is that Jennifer wasn't lying. She truly believed her memory was accurate. But through suggestive police procedures, reinforcement, and the fallibility of recall, her mind had constructed a false memory. This happens more than we'd like to admit. The Innocence Project, an organization that works to exonerate wrongly convicted individuals, has found that eyewitness misidentification contributes to nearly 70% of wrongful convictions overturned by DNA evidence. That means in many cases, people are sent to prison, not because of deception, but because of genuine yet completely incorrect memories. But why does this happen? Why does our mind betray us like this? Memory is not a perfect recording device. Unlike a camera, which captures every detail exactly as it happens, human memory is reconstructive. Every time we recall something, our brain rebuilds that memory, often filling in gaps with details that were never there. And the more we think about a memory, the more likely it is to change, whether we realize it or not. Social influence, suggestion, and even time can reshape our memories. A single leading question can implant new details, and hearing someone else's version of an event can overwrite our own. This is why group discussions after a shared experience can lead to collective false memories, where people become convinced of events that never happened, simply because others in the group believe they did. Consider the Mandela Effect, a large-scale example of false memories at play. This is when a group of people collectively misremembers something in the same way. A famous example is the belief that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s when, in reality, he was released and lived until 2013. Another is the Berenstain Bears versus Berenstain Bears debate, where thousands of people swear the beloved children's books were spelled differently than they actually were. But the most disturbing aspect of false memories is their implications. If our memories can be altered so easily, then how much of what we recall is actually real? How many moments in our lives are just carefully crafted illusions, created, rewritten, or distorted by our own minds? This raises terrifying questions about how we perceive reality itself. What if the most important moments of our past are not as we remember them? What if, right now, you have memories that feel completely real but never actually happened? False memories prove that our past is not as stable as we think. Every time we recall an event, we change it, shaping it into something new. And over time, those small changes add up, until the memory we hold on to so dearly is no longer the same as the one that originally existed. The truth is, we cannot fully trust our own minds, and that realization is both fascinating and terrifying. Because if we can't trust our memories, what else have we forgotten that we should remember? And worse, what do we remember that was never real at all? The Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger Effect is one of the most unsettling and dangerous psychological phenomena in human cognition. It reveals a cruel paradox about intelligence, competence, and confidence. Those who know the least often believe they know the most. The more incompetent someone is, the more likely they are to overestimate their own abilities. Meanwhile, those who are actually skilled, knowledgeable, and experienced tend to be filled with doubt, constantly questioning themselves. This effect is not just a quirky psychological trick. It influences everything in our world, from politics to science to everyday life. It explains why the loudest voices are often the most ignorant, and why true experts hesitate before making bold claims. Imagine this. A person with little to no experience in a subject, whether it's finance, medicine, or politics, confidently speaks as if they are an expert. They have no doubts, no hesitation. They dismiss contrary opinions without consideration, acting as if they see the truth more clearly than anyone else. But when you actually listen to what they say, it becomes clear they don't truly understand the complexity of the topic. They oversimplify everything. They don't even know what they don't know. This is the Dunning-Kruger Effect in action. Named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, this effect was first identified in a groundbreaking study in 1999. The researchers tested people's abilities in logic, grammar, and humor, then asked them to estimate how well they performed. The results were shocking. Those who performed the worst consistently rated themselves as above average. They had no idea how incompetent they actually were. In contrast, those who performed the best tended to underestimate themselves, assuming that if something was easy for them, it must be easy for others too. The reason for this bias is simple. True competence requires an understanding of complexity. The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. But those who lack knowledge don't have enough awareness to recognize their own ignorance. They assume that their surface-level understanding is the full picture, leading to a dangerous mix of arrogance and misinformation. This effect explains so much about the world we live in. It's why some people confidently dismiss scientific facts they don't understand. It's why the least talented singers on talent shows seem convinced they will be superstars. It's why people who barely understand a political issue feel like they have all the answers, while actual experts struggle with nuance. And it gets worse. The internet has amplified the Dunning-Kruger effect to extreme levels. In the past, ignorance was often hidden, confined to personal conversations. But today, anyone can post their opinions online, creating echo chambers of misinformation. Social media rewards confidence, not accuracy. The people who shout the loudest, who make bold, simplistic claims, rise to the top of the algorithm. They gain followers, they build platforms, and they spread their overconfidence like wildfire. Meanwhile, real experts who acknowledge complexity and uncertainty are ignored or even ridiculed. Think about conspiracy theories. They thrive on the Dunning-Kruger effect. People who lack deep knowledge in science or history latch onto simple narratives that make them feel like they understand the world better than everyone else. They believe they have uncovered hidden truths that experts are too blind to see. In reality, they are mistaking their own ignorance for enlightenment. This effect also plays a role in leadership. Many incompetent people rise to power because confidence is often mistaken for competence. People are naturally drawn to leaders who appear certain, who speak without hesitation, who promise simple solutions to complex problems. But history has shown time and time again that some of the worst decisions have been made by the most confident fools. The irony of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the only way to escape it is through self-awareness. The moment you start to realize how much you don't know, you begin to move out of its grip. But here's the problem. Many people never reach that level of awareness. They remain trapped in a cycle of overconfidence, refusing to learn, refusing to grow, and worst of all, refusing to listen to those who actually understand. So, how do you protect yourself from falling into this trap? The first step is to question yourself constantly. If you find yourself feeling absolutely certain about a complex issue, ask, have I truly studied this? Have I considered different perspectives? True intelligence is not about having all the answers. It's about knowing which questions to ask. Surround yourself with people who challenge your views, not just those who confirm them. Seek out experts. Read research. Stay open to changing your mind. Because the moment you stop questioning, the moment you think you know everything, that's when the Dunning-Kruger effect takes hold. And finally, recognize it in others. The loudest voices aren't always the wisest. The most confident person in the room isn't necessarily the most knowledgeable. True expertise is quiet. It is thoughtful. It is filled with doubt, because the more you know, the more you see the endless depths of what you don't know. So the next time someone speaks with unshakable confidence about a subject they barely understand, remember, ignorance often masquerades as certainty, and true intelligence, it is humble, it is cautious, and it is always willing to learn. Change blindness. Change blindness is one of the most unsettling flaws in human perception. It is proof that our eyes can deceive us, that our memory is not as reliable as we think, and that our brains often prioritize assumption over reality. We walk through life believing we see everything around us, trusting that we would notice if something obvious changed right before our eyes. But the truth? We are blind to far more than we realize. This phenomenon has been demonstrated in countless psychological experiments, and the results are shocking. A person's outfit, a background object, even an entire face can change, and we don't notice. We assume that things stay the same unless we are deliberately paying attention, and that assumption makes us vulnerable. Imagine this. You're at a hotel check-in desk, talking to the receptionist. Midway through the conversation, the receptionist bends down to grab something, and when they stand up again, it's a completely different person. You would notice, right? Most people assume they would. But in a now famous experiment, researchers tested this exact scenario, and the majority of participants failed to realize they were speaking to a new person. Their minds simply filled in the gap, assuming that the person they had started talking to was still the same. This is change blindness, and it affects every single one of us. Our brains are designed for efficiency, not perfection. Instead of constantly analyzing every detail in our environment, we take shortcuts. We assume stability. We trust that if something was there a moment ago, it's still the same now. And while this makes life easier, it also leaves us alarmingly susceptible to missing even major changes right in front of us. This flaw in perception isn't just a quirky psychological trick. It has real-world consequences. It explains why eyewitness testimonies in court cases are often unreliable. A witness may believe they clearly saw a suspect's face, but in reality, their brain may have reconstructed the image using assumption rather than true memory. It's why people misremember details of accidents, failing to notice key changes in a scene. It's why pickpockets can steal wallets in plain sight. Magicians and illusionists have used change blindness for centuries, tricking audiences by exploiting the gaps in their perception. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Change blindness doesn't just affect everyday life, it affects history. Consider how much of human decision-making relies on observation and awareness. Military strategists, air traffic controllers, police officers, surgeons, these are all fields where missing a small but crucial change can mean the difference between life and death. Pilots who fail to notice a slight change in their instruments. Doctors who overlook a subtle shift in a patient's condition. Officers who fail to recognize a suspect, swapping clothing in a crowd. In each of these cases, change blindness is not just an interesting flaw, it's a critical weakness. But why does this happen? Why does the brain fail to recognize changes that seem obvious in hindsight? The answer lies in how we process visual information. Our eyes are not cameras. They do not take continuous, high-resolution snapshots of the world. Instead, our brains build a mental model of our surroundings based on fragments of information. When something changes outside of our focus, the brain doesn't update the entire scene. It simply assumes that everything is as it was. This is why distractions make change blindness even worse. In an experiment, participants were shown two nearly identical images, flickering back and forth with a small delay between them. The only difference? A single object in the scene was changing, perhaps a car disappearing, a building shifting colors, or a person's clothing altering slightly. Despite staring directly at the images, people often took several seconds, or even minutes, to spot the change. The delay between images disrupted the brain's ability to detect the shift. This has chilling implications for digital manipulation and misinformation. In a world where images and videos can be altered with extreme precision, how many changes are slipping past us without detection? Political ads, deepfake videos, historical revisions, our inability to instantly recognize changes in visual media makes us easy targets for deception. If a subtle change is introduced into a widely shared photograph, how many people would notice? And how many would believe they saw the original, unedited version, even if it had never existed? Change blindness also plays a role in human relationships. Think about how many times you've spoken to someone and later struggled to recall details about their appearance, their clothing, or even their facial expressions. We assume we are paying attention, but in reality our focus is selective. We absorb only the details we think are important at that moment, filtering out the rest. This is why, when someone close to us changes their hairstyle or wears a new outfit, we sometimes fail to notice, even when it seems glaringly obvious in hindsight. But perhaps the most unsettling part of change blindness is what it suggests about our perception of reality itself. If we can fail to notice simple visual changes, what else are we missing? How much of what we see is actually just an assumption? How many details do we construct in our minds without realizing that they were never there to begin with? This is the great paradox of the human brain. It is powerful, but it is flawed. It is capable of incredible feats of logic, creativity, and memory. Yet it is riddled with blind spots that shape the way we experience the world. We are not passive observers of reality. We are interpreters, constantly filling in gaps, reconstructing moments, and making unconscious edits to the story of our own lives. So, the next time you walk into a familiar room, take a closer look. The next time you speak to someone, challenge yourself to notice the details. Because the unsettling truth is, the world may not be as stable as you assume, and the changes happening right before your eyes, you may not even see them at all. The Impostor Syndrome. Imagine achieving everything you ever dreamed of: success, recognition, respect. People admire your work, your intelligence, your talent. They tell you that you're exceptional, that you deserve everything you have. And yet, deep inside, there's a voice whispering that they're all wrong, that you're a fraud, that you don't actually belong here, that at any moment someone will figure it out. They'll expose you. They'll realize that you've just been faking it all along. This is imposter syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where even the most accomplished people, CEOs, artists, scientists, doctors, writers, leaders, struggle with the unshakable feeling that they are frauds, that they haven't truly earned their success, even if all the evidence says otherwise. It's a deeply paradoxical experience, being outwardly successful while inwardly convinced you don't deserve any of it. But where does it come from? And why does it have such a powerful grip on even the brightest minds? To understand imposter syndrome, we need to look at something fundamental: the way we define success and failure. For most of human history, success was simple. If you hunted well, you ate. If you built shelter, you survived. But in today's world, success isn't always tangible. It's judged by recognition, achievements, and expectations. And expectations can be manipulated, both by society and by our own minds. Many people who experience imposter syndrome come from backgrounds where achievement was the standard. They grew up hearing that intelligence, talent, or hard work is what defines worth. But when they reach success, something strange happens. They don't feel the way they expected to feel. Instead of feeling accomplished, they feel exposed. The more they succeed, the more convinced they become that their success was due to luck, timing, or deception, anything but their own ability. This creates a dangerous loop. When someone believes they don't deserve success, they work even harder to avoid being found out. They push themselves to extremes, trying to prove their worth, but no matter how much they achieve, the feeling never goes away. In fact, it gets worse. Every new success becomes another lie they think they've told the world, another weight on their shoulders. Some of the most brilliant minds in history have battled imposter syndrome. Albert Einstein once admitted that he felt like an involuntary swindler. Maya Angelou, despite winning multiple awards and writing works that shaped literature, confessed that she was always afraid that someone would find out she wasn't really as talented as people believed. Even Tom Hanks, one of the most beloved actors in the world, has said that he sometimes thinks, "Why would anyone want to watch me in a movie?" Think about that. Some of the most universally admired, respected, and accomplished people in human history still felt like they didn't belong. If they could feel that way, what does it say about success itself? One of the most insidious aspects of imposter syndrome is that it's self-perpetuating. The more someone achieves, the more their brain rewrites reality to explain it away. If they succeed, it must have been because of luck, connections, or some external factor. But if they fail, that's proof that they were never good enough to begin with. It's a rigged game, and the mind is playing against itself. But why does this happen? Neuroscientists believe that imposter syndrome is rooted in the way our brains process fear and self-perception. The human mind is constantly trying to predict outcomes. It looks for patterns, for consistencies, for certainty. And when success doesn't feel earned on a deep emotional level, the brain fills in the gaps with doubt. Imposter syndrome is also heavily linked to perfectionism. Many who experience it hold themselves to impossible standards, believing that if they aren't perfect at all times, then they must be failures. Every minor mistake, every overlooked detail becomes evidence that they aren't truly competent. And in a world where social media constantly magnifies everyone else's success, the illusion grows stronger, because people only see the highlights of others, not the struggles behind them. There's also a societal aspect to imposter syndrome. Studies show that women and minorities experience it at much higher rates, largely due to the historical barriers they have faced in professional fields. If you grow up in a world that constantly suggests you don't belong, it's not surprising that, even when you do succeed, a part of you still believes it was all a mistake. So, how do we fight imposter syndrome? The first step is recognition, understanding that just because you feel like a fraud doesn't mean you are one. Feelings are not facts. The brain can lie to you, and imposter syndrome is one of the biggest lies it tells. The second step is rewriting the narrative. Instead of attributing success to luck or deception, learning to see the work, effort, and skill that went into it is crucial. Success isn't an accident. It's built over time, and nobody succeeds without effort. One of the most powerful ways to counteract imposter syndrome is to collect proof against it. Keeping a journal of achievements, compliments, and moments of success can help rewire the brain to recognize patterns of competence. When doubt creeps in, having concrete reminders of past successes can be a weapon against self-doubt. Another method is to talk about it. The more people discuss imposter syndrome, the more they realize they are not alone. The irony is that most of the people who feel like frauds are exactly the ones who aren't, because true incompetence doesn't come with self-awareness. If someone is doubting themselves, it likely means they are thoughtful, reflective, and striving to improve. Perhaps the biggest lesson of all is this: success does not require perfection. It does not require certainty. It does not require a flawless, unshakable belief in oneself. Every person who has achieved something great has also, at some point, felt undeserving of it. But success isn't about feeling ready. It's about moving forward despite the doubt. So, the next time you feel like an imposter, remind yourself of this. If Albert Einstein, Maya Angelou, Tom Hanks, and some of the greatest minds in history all felt this way, then maybe, just maybe, you aren't a fraud. Maybe you're exactly where you're supposed to be, because the real imposter isn't you. It's the voice in your head telling you that you don't belong. Pareidolia. Imagine walking into a dark room and seeing a face staring at you from the shadows. Your heart races, your breath catches. But when you turn on the light, it's just a pile of clothes, a jacket hanging from a chair, or maybe you're home alone and hear your name whispered in the wind, a faint voice calling from the distance. But there's no one there. These are not supernatural encounters. This is pareidolia, an ancient survival mechanism buried deep within our brains, tricking us into seeing faces in inanimate objects and hearing voices where none exist. Pareidolia is the tendency of our minds to perceive familiar patterns, particularly faces and voices, in random stimuli. It's why we see human-like expressions in car headlights, recognize figures in clouds, and hear phantom whispers and static noise. This quirk of perception is a side effect of the brain's pattern recognition system, an ability that evolved to keep us alive. In the distant past, seeing a hidden predator in the bushes or mistaking a tree's shadow for a lurking enemy might have meant the difference between life and death. Our ancestors who reacted first, whether the threat was real or not, had a higher chance of surviving. But in the modern world, this same system malfunctions. The same instincts that once saved us now deceive us, making us see faces in electrical outlets or ghostly figures in the corner of our eyes. Our brain prioritizes false positives. It's better to be wrong and scared than to be right and dead. And this simple evolutionary trick might explain why so many paranormal experiences happen in the dark, in moments of uncertainty, or in places where fear is already present. One of the most famous examples of pareidolia is the face on Mars. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft captured an image of the Martian surface. The image showed a massive rock formation that looked unmistakably like a human face, complete with eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Many believed this was proof of ancient alien civilizations, evidence that something intelligent had once existed on the Red Planet. But when higher resolution images were taken decades later, the face disappeared. It was just an ordinary rock formation, its illusion created by light and shadow. This ability to create meaning from randomness doesn't just happen visually, it also happens through sound. Ever listened to static and thought you heard a faint voice? Or played a song in reverse and suddenly made out hidden words? That's Pareidolia at work. It's the reason people hear ghostly voices in white noise, and why supposed backmasked messages, hidden phrases in songs played backward, have convinced many of subliminal messages being secretly implanted into music. One chilling experiment demonstrates just how powerful auditory pareidolia can be. Researchers played random noise to participants and told them to listen carefully. Some were primed with the idea that they might hear hidden words or messages. Astonishingly, many reported hearing full sentences, names, or warnings, despite there being nothing but meaningless sound. This is why ghost hunters using spirit boxes or EVP recordings often hear voices. It's not paranormal, it's psychological. Our brains are constantly searching for familiar patterns, and when they can't find them, they create them. But pareidolia doesn't just influence our perception of the world, it affects art, religion, and history. Throughout time, people have seen divine images in toast, tree bark, and even oil stains. The infamous Virgin Mary on a grilled cheese sandwich sold for $28,000 because to the human mind, it wasn't just burn marks on bread, it was a spiritual sign. And what about horror? Some of the scariest moments in film and real life come from pareidolia. The fear that something is watching you from the darkness, the terrifying sensation of a face forming in the shadows, all of it is the result of your mind desperately trying to make sense of the unknown. Our brains would rather see a face where there is none than risk missing a predator that is actually there. But here's the truly terrifying question. If our minds are so easily fooled, then how much of what we see and hear is even real? How many of our experiences are genuine? And how many are nothing more than shadows and whispers our brain has stitched together from nothing? Pareidolia is more than just a glitch in perception. It is a window into how fragile our reality truly is. It proves that our world is not just what we see, but what our brain wants us to see. And if our own minds can't always be trusted, what else have we been seeing, hearing, and believing that never truly existed at all? The Spotlight Effect. The Spotlight Effect is one of the most powerful psychological illusions that control our daily lives, often without us even realizing it. We step into a room, we say something awkward, we make a mistake, or we feel self-conscious about our appearance, and immediately, it feels like every single person around us has noticed. We imagine them judging us, whispering about us, analyzing every detail of our imperfections. But here's the truth. No one is paying as much attention to us as we think. In reality, people are too absorbed in their own lives, their own worries, and their own insecurities to truly care about our flaws. This cognitive bias is known as the spotlight effect, the tendency to believe that we are being noticed far more than we actually are. It's a psychological trick, a cruel distortion of reality, making us feel like we are under a bright, relentless spotlight, when, in truth, we are just another face in the crowd. It's why we replay embarrassing moments in our minds for days, weeks, even years, when most of the people who witnessed them have already forgotten within minutes. Imagine a moment from your own life. Perhaps it was the time you tripped in front of a group of people, stumbled over your words during a presentation, or wore something that didn't quite fit right. That burning shame, that overwhelming fear that everyone saw, that everyone laughed inside, that everyone will remember you for this one humiliating moment. But ask yourself this: how often do you remember the small, awkward mistakes of others? How many people's minor blunders are etched into your memory? The answer is likely close to none, because as much as we believe others are fixated on us, they aren't. This illusion is deeply rooted in human psychology. Our brains evolved to be hyper-aware of our social standing, because in the past, being ostracized from a group could mean death. We carry that ancient wiring with us today. Even though society has changed, we are constantly overestimating how much other people care about what we do, what we say, how we look. We think our flaws are magnified in their eyes, but the truth is, Everyone is operating under their own spotlight effect. They are just as trapped in their own self-consciousness as we are in ours. Research has proven this time and time again. In a famous study, participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt with a large, goofy face on it and walk into a room full of strangers. Beforehand, they were asked to estimate how many people would notice the shirt and remember it later. The result? Participants dramatically overestimated how many people even cared. Most in the room never even noticed the t-shirt at all. This is the reality of human perception. People are too distracted by their own worries, their own lives, and their own insecurities to scrutinize us as much as we assume. And yet, the spotlight effect continues to haunt us. It makes us afraid to raise our hand in class, to speak up in a meeting, to wear what we truly want, to dance, to laugh, to take risks. It keeps us locked in a prison of self-doubt, suffocating under the weight of imaginary judgment. But here's the most liberating truth of all. Once you understand that the spotlight effect exists, once you internalize that no one is thinking about you nearly as much as you think they are, you are free. Free to be yourself. Free to live without the constant fear of what others might think. Think about the people you admire. Are they the ones who played it safe, who shrank themselves out of fear of judgment? Or are they the ones who stood boldly, unapologetically themselves, unfazed by what others might say? Confidence is not about never feeling self-conscious. It's about realizing that in the grand scheme of things, our small mistakes, our awkward moments, our perceived flaws, none of them matter as much as we think they do. And here's something even more powerful. When we let go of the spotlight effect, we also become kinder, more understanding people. Because if we're so focused on our own perceived flaws, isn't it possible that everyone else is too? When we understand that others are battling their own insecurities, their own fears of judgment, we stop being so critical of them. We become more compassionate, more forgiving, and in turn, we cultivate an energy that draws people towards us. The reality is, the world is not a stage where every person is analyzing our every move. It's a collection of individuals, each struggling with their own fears, their own doubts, their own personal battles. And the irony? While you're busy worrying about what others think of you, they're busy worrying about what you think of them. We are all caught in the same illusion, prisoners of our own overactive self-consciousness. So the next time you feel that unbearable weight of judgment, the next time you hesitate to do something because you fear how you will be perceived, remember this. The spotlight isn't real. The world is not watching your every move. You are far more free than you realize. And in that freedom, in that understanding, lies the power to truly live. The illusory truth effect. Imagine hearing a statement for the first time. It sounds ridiculous, obviously false. You dismiss it without a second thought. But then, you hear it again, and again, and again. Slowly, something strange happens. It starts to feel less false. The edges of doubt begin to soften. And before you even realize it, a small part of you begins to wonder. Could it actually be true? This is the illusory truth effect, a psychological phenomenon where repetition makes falsehoods feel like truth. It's one of the most disturbing glitches in human cognition, one that has been exploited for centuries by propaganda, misinformation, and deception. The terrifying part? It works on everyone, even if you're intelligent, even if you think you're immune, even if you know, logically, that what you're hearing is false. To understand why this happens, we have to dive deep into the mechanics of belief. The human brain is constantly bombarded with information, filtering, analyzing, and trying to make sense of the world. But the mind isn't designed to question everything. If it did, life would be exhausting. So instead, the brain relies on mental shortcuts to determine what's likely to be true. And one of the biggest shortcuts it uses, familiarity. We naturally associate familiarity with truth. If something sounds familiar, our brain assumes it must be credible. This is why repeated exposure to an idea makes it feel more trustworthy, even when the idea itself is completely wrong. The first major study on the illusory truth effect was conducted in 1977. Researchers asked participants to rate how true a series of statements were. Some of the statements were repeated multiple times throughout the experiment. The result? Even when participants knew certain statements were false, they rated them as more truthful the more they heard them. This means that just hearing a falsehood enough times makes it seem real, and the implications of this are chilling. It explains why propaganda works, Why political lies, even when debunked, still influence millions. Why advertising convinces us we need things we don't. Why conspiracy theories spread. And why misinformation thrives on social media, where the sheer repetition of a statement, regardless of its accuracy, gives it power. But let's go deeper. How does this shape our perception of reality itself? Think about the stories you've been told your entire life, the narratives you've absorbed through culture, media, history, books. How many of them are true, and how many do you believe simply because you've heard them so many times? The frightening truth is that our minds are not built to distinguish reality from repetition. And this doesn't just apply to politics or advertising. It affects every aspect of life. Take urban legends. Many of them persist not because they're true, but because they've been repeated for generations. The idea that humans only use 10% of their brains? False. But you've probably heard it so often that it feels real. The idea that lightning never strikes the same place twice? Also false. But repeated so many times that it's become ingrained in public consciousness. This is why misinformation spreads like a virus. It doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be repeated. Now, let's take it one step further. What happens when the illusory truth effect is weaponized? Throughout history, regimes and dictators have deliberately used this effect to manipulate entire populations. One of the most infamous examples is Nazi propaganda. Adolf Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, understood the power of repetition better than anyone. He once said, "A lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth." This wasn't just an observation. It was a strategy. By repeating certain narratives over and over, the Nazi regime convinced millions of people to believe horrific falsehoods, leading to some of the darkest atrocities in history. But this isn't just a relic of the past. It's happening right now. In the age of the internet, where information spreads faster than ever, the illusory truth effect has been supercharged. False information about politics, science, medicine can be repeated thousands of times within hours. And with every repetition, it feels more real. This is why fake news spreads faster than truth. Because truth takes effort to verify, but falsehoods only need repetition. A single misleading headline, repeated across multiple platforms, can reshape public perception in ways that facts alone can't undo. And here's where it gets terrifying. Once the illusory truth effect takes hold, even direct evidence often fails to break it. Studies show that when people have already been exposed to a falsehood multiple times, simply presenting the truth isn't enough to override the illusion. In some cases, confronting someone with contradictory facts actually makes them cling to the falsehood even harder, because now their brain has anchored that belief into their identity, and challenging it feels like an attack. So, how do we defend ourselves against this phenomenon? First, we have to question familiarity. Just because something sounds familiar doesn't mean it's true. If you find yourself believing something, ask yourself, do I believe this because it's been repeated to me, or do I believe it because I've examined the facts? Second, we need to slow down. The faster we consume information, the less time we spend critically analyzing it. Misinformation thrives in environments where people don't stop to think. If something triggers a strong emotional reaction, anger, outrage, fear, that's usually a sign that it's designed to bypass logic. Third, we must recognize that even we are not immune. The most dangerous assumption is believing that this only happens to other people. The reality is that every human brain is vulnerable to the illusory truth effect, no matter how intelligent or rational we think we are. The truth is fragile. It doesn't spread as easily as lies. It requires effort to maintain. But if we don't actively fight against misinformation, against the power of repetition, then reality itself becomes something that can be manufactured. And in a world where truth can be rewritten through sheer repetition, the question we must ask ourselves is, are we truly thinking for ourselves, or are we just repeating what we've been told? The placebo effect's evil twin, the Nocebo effect. Imagine being told that the pill you just swallowed contains a lethal poison. Your heart starts pounding, your body breaks into a cold sweat, and you begin to feel weak. Your breath becomes shallow, your vision blurs, and you collapse. Moments later, you're rushed to the hospital, only for doctors to reveal the shocking truth. The pill was harmless. It contained nothing but sugar. Yet, your body reacted as if death was imminent. This isn't magic. This isn't some supernatural curse. This is the nocebo effect, the the dark twin of the placebo effect, where your belief in harm is so strong that it actually manifests as real physical symptoms, sometimes even death. The nocebo effect is one of the most terrifying phenomena in human psychology because it proves that our minds have the power to destroy us. It has been responsible for people suffering severe side effects from harmless substances, experiencing real pain from fake injuries, and even dying, simply because they believed they would. To understand how powerful the nocebo effect is, let's start with a horrifying true story. In the late 1970s, a man named Sam Lund was diagnosed with advanced esophageal cancer. His doctors believed it was terminal, and Sam was told he had only a few months to live. Just as predicted, he rapidly deteriorated. His strength faded, his body withered, and soon he passed away. But there was a problem. When an autopsy was conducted, doctors made a chilling discovery. Sam Lund didn't have terminal cancer. Yes, he had minor esophageal tumors, but they had not spread. There was no physical reason for his death. What killed him was the belief that he was dying. His mind had accepted his fate, and his body followed. This is the true horror of the nocebo effect. What we believe can kill us. And the scariest part? It's happening all the time. Consider another case. In the 1990s, a man took part in a clinical drug trial for depression. One evening, after a painful breakup, he swallowed 29 capsules, attempting to end his life. He collapsed, struggling to breathe. At the hospital, doctors fought desperately to save him. His blood pressure had plummeted, his heart was barely beating. But when the researchers examined his records, they uncovered something shocking. The pills he had taken were placebos, sugar capsules, completely harmless. The moment he was told the truth, something unbelievable happened. Within minutes, his body began to stabilize. His blood pressure returned to normal, and within hours, he was completely fine. The only thing that had nearly killed him was his belief that he was dying. But the nocebo effect isn't just limited to extreme cases like these. It happens on smaller, everyday scales as well. If you believe a medication will cause nausea, headaches, or dizziness, there's a high chance you will actually experience those symptoms, even if the pill is a sugar pill. If a doctor tells you a procedure will be extremely painful, you are far more likely to suffer, because your brain primes your body for pain. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. The nocebo effect doesn't even require words to work. Studies have shown that even body language, tone of voice, and subtle suggestions can implant fear deep into our minds, triggering real symptoms. For example, in an experiment conducted by researchers in Japan, participants were told they would be exposed to a harmless plant that causes skin irritation. After exposure, many of them developed rashes, redness, and itching. But here's the terrifying part. The plant was completely fake. Their skin reacted as if it had been poisoned, all because their brain believed it. But this effect isn't just psychological, it's biological. When the brain expects harm, it triggers a cascade of real physical responses. Stress hormones flood the body, inflammation increases, and the immune system weakens. This is why people who believe they are cursed, hexed, or victims of black magic often fall seriously ill or even die. Their own brain makes it real. The implications of the nocebo effect are profound. It means that words, thoughts, and beliefs can shape our health and reality itself. It means that fear can be weaponized, intentionally or unintentionally. And it raises the chilling question, how many of our illnesses, symptoms, and pains are caused, not by actual disease, but by the belief that something is wrong? Doctors have struggled for years with how to handle this effect. How do you tell a patient about potential side effects without accidentally causing them? How do you warn someone of risks without their mind making those risks worse? The nocebo effect is a dark paradox, because the very act of warning people can create the very symptoms we are trying to prevent. And this leads to an even more disturbing realization. If belief alone can cause pain, suffering, and even death, then what else might our minds be capable of? If fear can kill, then what could hope do? If expectation can create illness, could it also create healing? The nocebo effect is a reminder of something terrifying yet profound. Our thoughts are not just abstract ideas. They are forces that can shape reality in ways we are only beginning to understand. So the next time you hear about a disease, a medication, or even a superstition, ask yourself, are you really in danger? Or is your mind the one creating the threat? Because if history has shown us anything, Sometimes, believing in harm is enough to make it real. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is one of the most unsettling and powerful forces in human psychology. It is the mental discomfort we feel when confronted with facts that contradict our deeply held beliefs. It is the reason people cling to falsehoods, even when presented with undeniable evidence. It is why we lie to ourselves without even realizing it, twisting reality to protect our own sense of self. And the most terrifying part? It controls us far more than we control it. This phenomenon was first studied by psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s. He discovered that when people hold two contradictory thoughts at the same time, their brains go into a state of distress. To escape that discomfort, they don't always change their beliefs to match the facts. Instead, they often distort the facts to match their beliefs. This is cognitive dissonance. It is a psychological defense mechanism designed to protect our ego, our identity, and our worldview from being shattered. Imagine you are a lifelong smoker. You know smoking causes cancer. You have seen the warnings, read the studies, and maybe even lost loved ones to it. Yet, you continue to smoke. This creates dissonance. Your actions and your knowledge are in direct conflict. So, what happens? Your brain tries to resolve that conflict. Instead of quitting, you start making excuses. My grandfather smoked for 50 years and lived to be 90. Stress is more dangerous than smoking. If cigarettes were really that bad, they would be illegal. None of these arguments are logical. They are distortions, but they allow you to continue smoking without feeling guilty. This effect is not just personal, it is global. It explains why people ignore scientific evidence, why political debates become so vicious, why cult members refuse to believe they were wrong even when their doomsday predictions fail. The moment we invest ourselves in a belief, especially if that belief is tied to our identity, we will do anything to protect it, even if that means lying to ourselves. One of the most infamous studies on cognitive dissonance involved a cult in the 1950s that believed the world would end on a specific date. When that day arrived and nothing happened, you might think the members would abandon their belief. But what actually happened was shocking. Instead of admitting they were wrong, they doubled down. They convinced themselves that their faith had saved the world. Their dissonance between their expectation of an apocalypse and the reality that nothing happened was too painful. So instead of changing their belief, they changed the way they interpreted the evidence. This is why people reject facts that contradict their worldview. When someone is presented with evidence that threatens their beliefs, their brain does not calmly analyze the information. Instead, it goes into defense mode. They attack the source. They look for counter-arguments, even if they are weak. They cherry-pick information that supports what they already believe. The more intelligent a person is, the better they are at defending their own illusions. Intelligence does not make someone immune to cognitive dissonance. In many cases, it makes them better at rationalizing their own biases. Look at history. When Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolves around the sun, people didn't just reject him. They ridiculed him, exiled him, and banned his work. The idea that Earth was not the center of the universe was too much for their minds to handle. It created unbearable dissonance. Their religious and philosophical beliefs told them one thing, but science told them another. Rather than accept reality, they fought against it. The same thing happens today. Climate change denial, vaccine misinformation, political propaganda, these are all fueled by cognitive dissonance. People are not rejecting facts because they lack intelligence. They are rejecting facts because those facts threaten their sense of identity. If someone has spent their entire life believing that a certain politician is a hero, then any evidence of corruption will not be processed neutrally. Instead, they will find a way to justify it. The media is lying. This is taken out of context. Everyone makes mistakes. Their brain is protecting them from the psychological pain of realizing they were wrong. But cognitive dissonance doesn't just affect society. It affects us all, every single day. Think about a time you made a mistake, but refused to admit it. Maybe you justified staying in a toxic relationship because you didn't want to accept that you had wasted years on the wrong person. Maybe you stayed in a dead-end job, convincing yourself that things would get better because the idea of leaving and starting over was too terrifying. Our brains crave consistency. We want to believe that we are good, rational, and in control, but the reality is we are constantly rewriting our own story to avoid facing hard truths. We hold on to bad investments because admitting failure hurts more than losing money. We dismiss valid criticism because accepting it would mean acknowledging our flaws. We lie to ourselves because the truth is too uncomfortable to bear. But there is a way out. The first step is awareness. If you understand that cognitive dissonance exists, you can begin to recognize it in your own life. The next time you feel defensive, ask yourself, am I resisting this idea because it's truly wrong, or because it challenges my beliefs? Be willing to question yourself. Be willing to change. The most intelligent and successful people are not the ones who never experience cognitive dissonance. They are the ones who recognize it and push through it. True growth comes from discomfort. If you can learn to embrace that discomfort, if you can face hard truths instead of running from them, you will gain something rare: clarity. The ability to see the world as it is, rather than as you wish it to be. And in a world filled with deception, misinformation, and self-imposed illusions, that is the greatest strength of all. The Mandela Effect. Imagine waking up one day to find out that something you were absolutely certain about, something you've known your whole life, never actually happened. You check, double-check, even ask others, and they all confirm the same disturbing truth. The memory you have, as vivid and real as it feels, is completely wrong. This is the Mandela Effect, a bizarre and unsettling phenomenon where large groups of people collectively misremember events, names, or facts that never actually happened. It's as if reality itself has shifted, rewriting history in ways that don't make sense. One of the most famous examples? The Monopoly man's monocle. You can picture it, can't you? The little old man in the top hat, smiling with a monocle over one eye, except he never had one. Ever. Go look at every version of the Monopoly game, every old box, every official image. There is no monocle. And yet, millions of people around the world remember it vividly. How is that possible? How can so many people be so sure of something that never existed? To understand this mystery, we need to dive deep into the mechanics of memory, perception, and reality itself. The Mandela Effect gets its name from a false memory about Nelson Mandela's death. In the early 2000s, many people around the world distinctly recalled that Mandela had died in prison back in the 1980s. They even remembered watching news reports, reading obituaries, seeing world leaders mourn his death. But there was one problem. Nelson Mandela was still alive at the time. He wasn't released from prison until 1990 and later became South Africa's president. He didn't die until 2013. So where did this false memory come from? And why did so many people share it? The more people examined the phenomenon, the more examples began to surface. The Berenstain Bears, the famous children's book series, was always spelled Berenstain with an A, not Berenstein with an E. But countless people swear they remember it being Berenstein. The Fruit of the Loom logo, many recall it featuring a cornucopia, a horn overflowing with fruit. But the cornucopia was never there. The famous line from Star Wars, Luke, I am your father, it was never spoken. The actual line is, no, I am your father. But almost everyone remembers it differently. Pikachu's tail, many recall it having a black tip at the end. But no version of Pikachu has ever had that feature. And these aren't just minor spelling errors. These are deeply ingrained memories shared by millions of people. So what's happening here? How can the same false memories exist in so many people? There are a few possible explanations. The most widely accepted scientific theory is that the Mandela effect is caused by memory reconstruction errors. Human memory is not a perfect recording device. It's fragile, fluid, and easily manipulated. Every time we recall a memory, our brain isn't just playing it back, it's rebuilding it. Small details get altered, information gets filled in based on what seems logical, and over time, false memories can feel just as real as true ones. For example, take the Monopoly man. We associate monocles with wealth and old-fashioned aristocrats. The Monopoly man looks like he should have one, so our brain fills in the gap. It's a glitch in pattern recognition, our minds trying to make sense of things based on familiar ideas, even if those ideas aren't correct. Another explanation involves social reinforcement. Once a false memory starts circulating, more people begin to adopt it. Someone says, hey, remember Pikachu's black tail? And others, instead of checking, trust their own distorted memory, reinforcing the belief. The more a false memory is repeated, the more real it feels. But then, there's the darker theory, the one that makes people question the very nature of reality. What if the Mandela effect is more than just memory errors? What if these false memories are evidence of reality shifting? Some believe the Mandela effect could be proof of parallel universes, alternate realities where things happen differently. The idea is that some individuals, for unknown reasons, retain memories from a parallel version of history, while the rest of the world has shifted into a slightly different timeline. It sounds like science fiction, but consider this. Quantum physics already suggests the possibility of multiple realities. The theory of the many worlds interpretation states that every choice, every possibility, creates a new branching universe. If this is true, is it so impossible to believe that sometimes fragments of other realities slip through? If millions of people remember something one way, and yet every piece of evidence says they are wrong, who's to say reality itself hasn't changed? There's also speculation that something or someone is editing reality. The idea of a simulated universe, where what we perceive as reality is actually a programmed system, suggests that the Mandela effect could be the result of glitches or updates in the simulation. Could it be that, at some level, reality is being altered, and the Mandela effect is the only trace left behind? Of course, there is no concrete evidence for any of these theories, but the questions remain. If human memory is so easily manipulated, how much of what we believe about history, about reality, is actually true? What else do we collectively misremember? What if there are bigger changes, ones we haven't even noticed yet? And if reality can shift, if memories can be rewritten, then what does that mean about who we are? The next time you swear you remember something a certain way, but find out you're wrong, ask yourself, is my memory failing me, or is reality itself shifting beneath my feet? The Zeigarnik Effect. Imagine watching a movie, completely engrossed as the tension builds. The protagonist is about to uncover the truth, the villain is moments away from being revealed, and then the screen goes black. To be continued appears. Your mind races, you feel restless, desperate for answers, and you can't stop thinking about it. This isn't just frustration, it's something much deeper, a psychological force hardwired into your brain. This is the Zeigarnik Effect, the reason unfinished tasks, unresolved stories, and unanswered questions haunt us far more than anything that's been completed. The Zeigarnik Effect was discovered by Bluma Zeigarnik, a Russian psychologist in the 1920s. She noticed something strange while sitting in a cafe. Waiters could remember unpaid orders with incredible accuracy, recalling exactly what customers had ordered. But once the bill was paid, they forgot everything. It was as if the information vanished from their minds the moment it was no longer needed. Intrigued, she conducted a series of experiments. Participants were given a set of simple tasks. Some they were allowed to finish, others were interrupted before completion. When tested later, the unfinished tasks were remembered far more vividly than the completed ones. It was as if the brain simply refused to let go of anything left unresolved. But why does this happen? Why do unfinished things hold power over us? The answer lies in how our brains process and store information. When a task is incomplete, the brain treats it as unfinished business, keeping it active, circling back to it, demanding resolution. But the moment we finish something, the brain closes the loop, moves on, and often forgets. In other words, our minds are wired to crave closure. And this effect isn't just about memory. It controls our emotions, our decisions, and even our behaviors. Think about cliffhangers in movies, TV shows, and books. The reason season finales leave you obsessed for months is because of this effect. The story isn't complete, so your brain fixates on it, running through possibilities, imagining outcomes. Writers, directors, and marketers exploit this flaw in human psychology to keep you engaged, desperate for more. Take the hit TV show Lost. Week after week, it left audiences with more questions than answers, revealing just enough to keep people obsessing over theories, dissecting every scene, and speculating endlessly. Fans were hooked, not necessarily because of what they saw, but because of what they were denied. And the effect is even stronger in real life. Have you ever left a task unfinished, only to feel constant, nagging anxiety about it? Maybe it's an email you haven't replied to, a conversation you walked away from, or a goal you abandoned halfway. Your mind keeps bringing it back, looping it over and over, refusing to let it go. The Zeigarnik Effect explains why procrastination feels so heavy. Because when we put something off, it doesn't disappear. It lingers, creating mental clutter, making us feel overwhelmed and restless. It's why people struggle to fall asleep when they have unfinished business, because their brain is still processing what hasn't been resolved. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. The Zeigarnik Effect isn't just about memory. It can actually manipulate our emotions, change our behaviors, and even control us. Consider relationships. Unfinished emotional business can haunt people for years. The breakup without closure, the fight that never had a resolution, the love confession left unsaid. These stay with us, replaying in our minds, creating emotional scars that don't heal. It's also why ghosting someone is so psychologically painful. When someone disappears without an explanation, your brain doesn't get the closure it craves, and it keeps you stuck in an endless loop of wondering, overanalyzing, and searching for an answer that never comes. And what about social media? Think about why notifications feel addictive. You open an app, see a message preview, but don't have time to respond, so your brain fixates on it until you do. Platforms like Twitter and Instagram exploit this effect, giving you partial information to keep you coming back. Ever noticed how news articles will say, "You won't believe what happened next," but never give away the full answer in the headline? That's the Zeigarnik Effect, forcing you to click. The same principle explains why people stay in toxic relationships, jobs they hate, or unfinished projects they no longer care about. Because walking away means leaving something unresolved, and the mind hates that. It's easier to stay trapped in something bad than to endure the mental torment of an unanswered question. But here's the real question. Can we use this effect to our advantage? The answer is yes. If unfinished tasks keep our minds engaged, we can hack the Zeigarnik Effect to boost motivation. Instead of dreading starting something new, just begin. Once you've started, your brain will fight to finish it, keeping you mentally hooked. This is why writers stop in the middle of a sentence, so their mind forces them to continue the next day. It's why students who start a project, even if they don't finish it, are far more likely to complete it later. And what about breaking free from the anxiety of unfinished business? The key is closing mental loops. If you can't finish something, write it down. Studies show that simply acknowledging an unfinished task reduces its mental weight. Instead of letting unresolved conversations haunt you, accept the lack of closure and let it go. The Zeigarnik Effect is proof that our minds are not passive recorders of reality. They are active manipulators of attention, emotion, and obsession. So the next time you feel trapped by an unfinished task, an unresolved question, or an unanswered mystery, ask yourself, is this real, or is my mind holding me hostage? Because sometimes the only way to escape the loop is to break it yourself. The missing dollar riddle, math illusion. The missing dollar riddle is one of the most mind-bending mathematical illusions ever created. It confuses people not because the math is wrong, but because the way we frame numbers manipulates how our brains interpret them. It's a simple problem, just a few dollars exchanged between a few people, but it reveals something profound about human cognition. Our brains are wired to recognize patterns, but sometimes those patterns deceive us. So, let's break it down. 3 people check into a hotel room. The cost of the room is $30, so they each contribute $10, handing the hotel a total of $30. But after they pay, the hotel realizes there was a discount, and the room should only have cost $25. To fix this, the hotel gives $5 back to the guests. But here's where things get tricky. The 3 guests decide to each keep $1 for themselves and give the remaining $2 to the bellboy as a tip. Now, let's do the math as most people instinctively do it. Each guest originally paid $10, but they got $1 back, meaning they actually paid $9 each. That's $27 total. The bellboy was given $2, so add that back in. That's $29. But wait, they started with $30. Where is the missing dollar? At first glance, this seems like a paradox. The numbers don't seem to add up. It's almost as if a single dollar has vanished into thin air, lost somewhere between the pockets of the guests and the hands of the bellboy. But the truth is, there is no missing dollar. The illusion comes from the way we are framing the numbers. The mistake lies in the way we are combining the numbers incorrectly. The $27 the guests paid is already accounting for the $2 that was given to the bellboy. That money is not separate. It is already included in the $27. Asterisk, asterisk. The real breakdown looks like this. The hotel keeps $25. The bellboy gets $2. The guests keep $3. The $1 each they received back. $25 plus $2 plus $3 equals $30. There is no missing dollar. The trick is in how the problem is framed. We are being misled into thinking that we should add the $2 to the $27, when in reality, we should be subtracting it to match the original $30. This riddle is not just a fun math trick, it is a demonstration of a powerful cognitive illusion. Our brains are extremely good at recognizing patterns, but they are also prone to misdirection. When presented with a set of numbers, we instinctively try to make them fit into an equation that makes sense. But when that equation is subtly incorrect, we don't always notice. This is the same principle behind optical illusions, where the way light and shadow interact tricks our brains into seeing movement or depth that isn't really there. In this case, instead of our eyes being deceived, it's our sense of logic. The missing dollar riddle is part of a larger class of mathematical tricks that exploit framing effects. The way information is presented changes the way we interpret it. This happens in everyday life far more often than we realize. Consider marketing. Companies use framing tricks all the time to influence how we perceive prices. Imagine you walk into a store and see a sign that says, originally $100, now only $70. Your brain immediately sees a $30 savings, making the price feel like a great deal. But in reality, you have no idea if that item was ever really worth $100 in the first place. The way the numbers are presented influences how we judge value. The same happens in politics and statistics. Imagine a news report saying, crime rates have dropped by 20%. That sounds great, until you realize that crime actually increased the year before, and what really happened was that it just returned to normal levels. The numbers are technically correct, but they are framed in a way that manipulates how we perceive reality. Our minds love narratives. We want numbers to fit into a clear, simple story. But reality is rarely simple. Numbers can be arranged, grouped, and presented in ways that completely change how they appear. The missing dollar riddle is a perfect demonstration of this effect. Our natural instinct is to think something has disappeared when, in reality, it's just been misrepresented. So, how can we protect ourselves from these kinds of illusions? The first step is awareness. Once you recognize that the way information is framed can influence your thinking, you can start to question it. When you see a surprising statistic, ask yourself, am I interpreting this the right way? Is there another way to look at these numbers? The second step is breaking down the problem logically, like we did with the riddle. Instead of being fooled by the way the numbers were presented, we looked at where the money actually went. This same approach can be applied to anything: advertising, arguments, news stories. Break it down. See where the numbers actually add up. Finally, the most important lesson is not to trust our instincts blindly. We like to think we are rational beings, but the truth is, our brains are not perfect calculators. We are easily fooled by the way information is presented. The missing dollar riddle is a harmless example, but the same principle can be used to deceive people on a much larger scale. So, the next time you see something that feels mathematically impossible, take a step back. Ask yourself, am I seeing the full picture, or am I just falling for a clever trick? Because in a world full of numbers, statistics, and financial games, the real illusion isn't the missing dollar. It's how easily we can be misled. The Backfire Effect. Imagine you're in a heated argument. You have facts, undeniable proof, and rock-solid logic on your side. You lay it all out, believing that once the other person sees the evidence, they'll change their mind. But instead of admitting they were wrong, they dig in even deeper. They double down, becoming more convinced than ever that they were right all along. This is the Backfire Effect, one of the most frustrating, irrational, and deeply human flaws in the way our minds process information. It's a phenomenon where, instead of accepting new facts that contradict their beliefs, people reject them and become even more entrenched in their original views. It's not just stubbornness, it's a psychological defense mechanism, and it affects everyone. To understand why this happens, we have to dive into the mechanics of belief, identity, and cognitive resistance. At its core, the Backfire Effect is a byproduct of cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort we feel when we're confronted with information that contradicts what we already believe. When something challenges our worldview, it creates an internal conflict between what we thought was true and what new evidence is telling us. And instead of accepting the discomfort and changing our minds, our brains take the easier route. We dismiss the new evidence, rationalize it away, and cling to what we already believed. Think about it. When was the last time you changed your mind about something big? Not just a trivial fact, but something that really mattered to you. It's incredibly rare. That's because our beliefs are not just ideas. They are extensions of our identity. Beliefs define how we see the world. They shape our values, our decisions, and even the way we define who we are. So when someone attacks a belief, especially one tied to our identity, it feels like an attack on us. And how do humans react to an attack? We defend. The Backfire Effect was first studied in 2006 by researchers Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler. They conducted an experiment where participants were shown false political statements, such as claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or policies about tax cuts. Then, they were given clear, undeniable evidence proving those statements were false. But instead of accepting the truth, participants who had originally believed the false statements became even more certain that they were true. The evidence didn't convince them. It backfired, reinforcing their original belief. And this isn't just a political issue, it applies to everything. Take conspiracy theories. If you try to debunk a conspiracy theorist's belief with hard evidence, what happens? They don't say, "Oh, you're right, I must have been wrong." Instead, they accuse you of being part of the cover-up. Every contradiction becomes proof that they were right. Or think about vaccines. Studies have shown that when people who believe vaccines are dangerous are presented with overwhelming scientific evidence proving they're safe, they don't just ignore it. They become more anti-vaccine than before. It's the same with climate change denial, flat earth theories, and countless other false beliefs. The more you try to correct them, the stronger their belief becomes. But why? Why does the mind reject truth in favor of comforting lies? One explanation lies in motivated reasoning, our brain's tendency to filter information in a way that protects our existing beliefs. When we hear something that aligns with what we already believe, we accept it instantly. When we hear something that contradicts us, our brain goes into defense mode. We start looking for ways to discredit it. And here's the terrifying part. The smarter a person is, the better they are at rationalizing false beliefs. Intelligence doesn't make people immune to the backfire effect. It makes them better at arguing against facts they don't like. This means that when we try to correct someone, they aren't actually evaluating the evidence. They're hunting for flaws in it, looking for any reason to dismiss it so they can keep believing what they already do. This is why debates so often feel pointless. We think we're having a discussion, but in reality, both sides are just reinforcing their own beliefs. So, if facts don't work, what does? The key to overcoming the backfire effect isn't confrontation, it's connection. Studies show that attacking a person's beliefs head-on only makes them stronger. But if you approach them without judgment, if you make them feel safe, if you ask questions instead of lecturing them, something incredible happens. The walls come down. Instead of triggering a fight-or-flight response, you engage their critical thinking. Instead of telling them they're wrong, you let them explore the possibility that they might be. For example, instead of saying, "You're wrong about climate change, here's the proof," a better approach might be, "I understand why you'd feel that way. Can you tell me what convinced you? I'd love to understand." By shifting the conversation from an argument to a discussion, you create an environment where the other person doesn't feel attacked. And once they feel safe enough to think critically, they may start questioning their own beliefs, on their own. But this is incredibly difficult, because it requires patience, empathy, and humility. 3 things that are often missing in debates. So, what does this mean for society? If truth itself backfires, if people become more convinced of falsehoods when confronted with facts, how do we prevent misinformation from spreading? It starts with awareness. If we recognize that the backfire effect is real, we can change the way we communicate. Instead of bombarding people with facts, we can focus on understanding their fears, their emotions, and their reasons for believing what they do. It also means that we need to stop assuming that people believe falsehoods because they're stupid. Intelligence has nothing to do with it. Everyone is vulnerable to the backfire effect. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all, if the backfire effect works on others, it works on us too. So, the next time you're presented with information that contradicts your beliefs, stop and ask yourself, Am I rejecting this because it's false? Or am I rejecting it because it makes me uncomfortable? Because if we aren't careful, we don't just risk letting others fall into falsehoods. We risk becoming victims of the Backfire Effect ourselves. The Einstellung Effect. Imagine standing in front of a puzzle, one that should be easy to solve. You have all the pieces, all the tools, and yet, you can't see the answer. You struggle, convinced that the method you've always used will work, even as it fails over and over again. You refuse to look at the problem from a new angle. You are trapped in your own thinking. This is the Einstellung Effect, one of the most insidious flaws in human cognition. It's the reason why people fail to see obvious solutions, why brilliant minds get stuck on the wrong approach, and why sometimes experience is the very thing that blinds us. The Einstellung Effect, first identified in the 1940s by psychologist Abraham Luchins, is a mental trap, where past knowledge and familiar strategies prevent us from seeing better, simpler, or more effective solutions. It happens to experts, professionals, and even the most creative problem solvers. The more experience someone has with a certain type of problem, the more likely they are to default to old methods, even when those methods no longer work. To understand just how powerful this effect is, Luchins designed an experiment using a simple water jug puzzle. Participants were given 3 containers of different sizes and asked to measure out a specific amount of water. They quickly learned a long, complicated method to get the correct amount. Then, something strange happened. Luchins presented them with a new set of problems, where a much easier solution was possible. But instead of finding the shortcut, most people stubbornly stuck to the complicated method they had learned before. Even when the answer was right in front of them, their past experience blocked them from seeing it. And here's where it gets terrifying. This doesn't just happen in puzzles. It happens in real life. Think about firefighters responding to an emergency. In 1949, a group of smoke jumpers, highly trained firefighters, were battling a devastating wildfire in Montana. The fire unexpectedly shifted direction, racing toward them at incredible speed. Their only chance of survival was to run. But one firefighter, Wagner Dodge, saw a different solution. Instead of running, he did the unthinkable. He lit the grass around him on fire. By doing so, he created a small patch of burned ground that the larger fire couldn't consume. He lay down in the ashes as the wildfire roared over him. But the other firefighters? They didn't follow. They stuck to their training, run away from the fire, find an escape route. But there was none. 13 of them died. Dodge survived. They had been trapped by the Einstellung Effect, unable to see an obvious, life-saving solution because it wasn't in their training. This same cognitive trap is why experienced doctors misdiagnose illnesses, why CEOs make bad business decisions, and why war strategists repeat history's mistakes. The more we rely on past knowledge, the harder it becomes to break free from it. And it gets worse. The Einstellung Effect isn't just about problem solving. It affects our relationships, our careers, and our entire way of thinking. Have you ever been in an argument where you were so convinced you were right that you didn't even consider another perspective? That's the Einstellung Effect. It keeps people locked in outdated beliefs, stubbornly clinging to old ideas even when better ones exist. Think about technological innovation. When the first automobiles were introduced, most people dismissed them as impractical, because horses had worked just fine for centuries. When email first emerged, many businesses ignored it, believing letters and fax machines were enough. The more we rely on what we know, the more resistant we become to change. And what about in science? For decades, doctors believed ulcers were caused by stress and diet. Patients were prescribed bland food, relaxation therapy, and antacids. Then, in 1982, 2 Australian scientists, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, discovered the truth. Ulcers were caused by bacteria. They found a simple cure: antibiotics. But the scientific community refused to believe them. Their research was mocked. The medical world was trapped in the Einstellung Effect, convinced that the old explanation was correct, even as patients continued to suffer. It took years for the truth to be accepted. And in that time, countless people suffered needlessly, all because the world refused to let go of an outdated idea. So, how do we break free from this cognitive prison? How do we escape the trap of our own minds? The answer is to think like a beginner. Instead of assuming we already know the right answer, we must question everything. Instead of relying on what worked in the past, we must ask, is there a better way? The greatest breakthroughs in history came from those who dared to challenge conventional wisdom, who refused to let past knowledge blind them. This is why children, unburdened by experience, often solve problems that adults struggle with. They are not trapped by preconceptions. They see possibilities that others overlook. So, the next time you face a challenge, ask yourself, am I thinking freely or am I stuck in an old way of doing things? Because the truth is, the biggest obstacle to finding a better solution isn't the problem itself. It's your own mind. The white bear effect, ironic process theory. Imagine this. I tell you, do not think of a white bear. Whatever you do, do not picture a white bear in your mind. Do not imagine its thick fur, its black nose, its large paws pressing against the snow. Do not let the image of a white bear appear in your thoughts. And yet, there it is. The white bear. The more you try to push it away, the stronger it becomes. This is not just a mental trick. It is a profound flaw in the way our minds work, a psychological phenomenon known as the white bear effect, or ironic process theory. And whether we realize it or not, it controls far more of our lives than we would like to believe. The white bear effect was first studied by psychologist Daniel Wegner in the 1980s. In a simple experiment, he asked participants to sit quietly and try to suppress a thought. Specifically, they were told not to think about a white bear for 5 minutes, but every time they caught themselves thinking about it, they had to ring a bell. The result? The bells rang constantly. No matter how hard they tried, they could not stop the thought from creeping into their minds. And what's worse, after the experiment, even when they were allowed to think about anything they wanted, the white bear still appeared in their thoughts more often than for people who had never been asked to suppress it. Trying to force the thought away had made it even stronger. This happens because our brains do not process negation the way we expect. When you tell yourself not to think about something, your brain has to constantly check whether it is following the rule. Ironically, that very act of checking keeps the unwanted thought alive. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The more you push, the more forcefully it fights back. But this effect is not just about white bears. It controls our emotions, our anxieties, our habits, every aspect of our psychological experience. Think about it. You are lying in bed, exhausted, and you tell yourself, I need to sleep right now. But the more you try to force sleep, the more awake you feel. You start focusing on your breathing, on your heartbeat, on the very idea of falling asleep, and suddenly, it becomes impossible. Or, imagine you were trying to quit a bad habit, smoking, biting your nails, checking your phone. You tell yourself, do not think about smoking. Do not think about checking your phone. And yet, because you are constantly reminding yourself not to do it, your mind keeps circling back to it, making the temptation even stronger. This is why people who try to suppress anxiety often feel it even more intensely. If you tell yourself, don't panic, stay calm, don't be nervous, your brain constantly monitors whether you are anxious or not. That act of self-monitoring feeds the anxiety, trapping you in a loop of stress. Even in relationships, the white bear effect plays a role. If you try to suppress thoughts about an ex, or an embarrassing moment, or a painful regret, those are the very thoughts that will keep resurfacing. This is why breakups can be so difficult. Because the more you tell yourself, I need to stop thinking about them, the more your mind drags you back to their memory. So what can we do? If suppressing a thought only makes it stronger, how do we stop an unwanted thought from taking over our minds? The answer is counterintuitive, but incredibly powerful. Instead of resisting the thought, you must acknowledge it. Instead of fighting the white bear, you let it exist. You observe it without judgment. You accept it without resistance. This is the basis of mindfulness, a practice rooted in ancient philosophy, but now confirmed by modern psychology. When a thought arises, instead of pushing it away, you simply notice it. You recognize it for what it is, a fleeting event in the mind. Not a command, not a truth, not a threat. You let it pass, like a cloud drifting across the sky. Studies have shown that acceptance is far more effective than suppression. People who acknowledge their unwanted thoughts but don't engage with them experience fewer intrusive thoughts over time. Instead of trying to drown out the noise, they learn to let it fade on its own. This has profound implications for mental health. Imagine someone struggling with obsessive thoughts, anxieties, or compulsions. If they try to suppress their fears, the fears grow stronger. But if they acknowledge them without feeding them, the thoughts begin to lose their power. The white bear effect is not just a quirky psychological trick. It is a window into the deepest mechanisms of our consciousness. It reveals the paradox of control. The more we try to force our minds into submission, the more chaotic they become. True mastery comes not from suppression, but from understanding. Not from avoidance, but from awareness. So the next time an unwanted thought enters your mind, don't fight it. Don't try to push it away. Just observe it. Let it be. Because the moment you stop resisting, you might just find that the white bear fades into the background on its own. The Observer-Expectancy Effect. The Observer-Expectancy Effect is one of the most unsettling flaws in human perception. A phenomenon so powerful that it has altered the course of scientific research, shaped educational outcomes, and even distorted reality itself. It reveals a terrifying truth. The simple act of observing something is never truly neutral. The expectations of the observer, their beliefs, their biases, their unconscious assumptions, can subtly and sometimes drastically alter what they see. This effect isn't just some abstract concept. It has been proven time and time again in experiments. Scientists, researchers, teachers, and even everyday people unknowingly influence the results of their own observations. The mind, it turns out, is not an impartial recorder of truth. It is an active participant, shaping the world according to its expectations. One of the most famous demonstrations of this effect comes from clever Hans, a horse in early 20th century Germany that astonished the world with its ability to solve math problems. If someone asked Hans to add 3 plus 4, the horse would tap its hoof 7 times, seemingly performing arithmetic. People believed this animal had an extraordinary intellect, a mathematical mind in the body of a horse. Scientists and crowds alike were stunned. But then came the truth. A psychologist named Oskar Pfungst carefully studied Hans and made a groundbreaking discovery. Hans was not doing math at all. Instead, he was unconsciously reading subtle cues from the humans around him. When Hans tapped his hoof, the humans observing him would involuntarily tense up as he neared the correct number, and when he reached the right count, they would slightly relax. Hans, incredibly perceptive, picked up on these micro-expressions and stopped tapping at the right number. The humans had unknowingly altered the results of the experiment. They believed the horse could do math, and their unconscious reactions guided the outcome. This is the Observer-Expectancy Effect in action, and it happens everywhere. Consider scientific research. The entire foundation of science is built on objective observation. Yet, time and again, researchers have found that their own expectations subtly influence their studies. In psychology and medicine, studies have shown that when researchers expect a particular outcome, they might unconsciously interpret ambiguous data in a way that supports their hypothesis. They might spend more time analyzing results that confirm their beliefs while overlooking contradictory evidence. Even in the hardest of sciences, physics and biology, small unintentional biases can creep in, skewing results and sometimes leading to false conclusions. This is why the double-blind study was invented. In high-stakes experiments, such as drug trials, neither the researchers nor the participants know which group is receiving the real treatment and which is getting a placebo. Why? Because even the subtlest change in tone, wording, or expression from the researcher could unconsciously influence the participant's response. The expectation that a drug will work can sometimes make it appear to work, even when it doesn't. Now, think about education. The Observer-Expectancy Effect is not just confined to laboratories, it shapes the way students are taught. In the 1960s, a fascinating study known as the Pygmalion Effect proved that a teacher's expectations can physically alter a student's performance. Researchers told a group of teachers that certain students in their class had tested exceptionally high on an intelligence test and would likely experience an academic growth spurt. But here's the twist. These students were chosen at random. They were no smarter than their classmates. And yet, by the end of the year, these students actually performed better than the rest. Why? Because the teacher's expectations shaped their behavior. Without realizing it, the teachers gave more encouragement, called on these students more often, provided better feedback, and created a self-fulfilling prophecy. This effect works both ways. If a teacher believes a student is lazy, they might subconsciously call on them less, offer less support, and expect failure, leading the student to actually perform worse. The student absorbs the expectation, reinforcing the belief in both the teacher and themselves. Now, expand this effect beyond the classroom. It affects job performance, relationships, sports, and even law enforcement. If a person expects someone to be dangerous, suspicious, or untrustworthy, their own behavior changes in subtle ways, leading to interactions that confirm their bias. Police officers expecting hostility might act more aggressively, triggering the very response they feared. Employers who assume a candidate is unqualified might overlook their potential. This is how self-fulfilling prophecies work. When we expect certain behaviors or outcomes, we often subconsciously create the conditions that make them real. So what can we do? How do we fight against this hidden force shaping our perception? First, awareness is everything. Recognizing that expectations can distort reality is the first step to preventing it. Question your assumptions. If you find yourself expecting a certain result, whether in research, in teaching, in relationships, ask yourself, am I seeing this objectively, or am I creating what I expect to see? Second, remove bias whenever possible. This is why double-blind experiments exist, why fair hiring practices require structured interviews, and why teachers should give equal attention to all students, not just the ones they subconsciously favor. And finally, understand that perception shapes reality. If you walk into a situation expecting failure, you might unconsciously create the conditions for it. But if you expect growth, if you expect progress, if you expect change, your mind might just shape the world in a way that makes it happen. The Observer-Expectancy Effect is not just about how we see the world, it is about how we create it. And once you realize that, you have the power to change everything. The Delboeuf Illusion. Imagine sitting down for a meal. You place a small portion of food on a large plate, and immediately it looks tiny, almost like it's not enough to satisfy you. Now, take that same portion, but this time, put it on a small plate. Suddenly it looks fuller, more satisfying, like a complete meal. Nothing has changed except the size of the plate, and yet, your brain is convinced that the second portion is bigger than the first. This is the Delboeuf Illusion, a powerful psychological trick that distorts how we perceive quantity. It's not just a curiosity, it affects what we eat, how much we consume, and even the way we judge portion sizes without realizing it. But why does this happen? And how does this simple illusion manipulate your mind, your diet, and even major industries? To understand the Delboeuf Illusion, we need to explore how the brain processes size, proportion, and contrast. The illusion is named after Joseph Delboeuf, a Belgian philosopher and mathematician who discovered it in 1865. He noticed that when two identical circles were placed side by side, one surrounded by a thin ring, the other by a thicker ring, people perceived the first circle as larger, even though both were the same size. This happens because our brain doesn't judge objects in isolation. It judges them relative to what surrounds them. When we see a small portion on a big plate, our brain compares it to the large empty space around it, making the portion appear smaller than it actually is. But when the same portion is placed on a small plate, the surrounding space is minimized, making the food appear larger and more satisfying. This illusion isn't just an interesting optical trick, it has real consequences for how much we eat. In a groundbreaking study in 2005, psychologist Brian Wason and his team conducted an experiment on portion perception. They served soup to participants in two different ways. Some received normal bowls, while others were given bowls that secretly refilled from the bottom, gradually adding more soup without them noticing. The result? The people with the refilling bowls ate 76% more soup than those with regular bowls, without realizing it. Their brains never registered that they were eating more because the portion never looked bigger. This is how the Delboeuf Illusion can lead to overconsumption. When food looks small, we instinctively eat more, thinking we haven't had enough. It's one of the hidden reasons why people struggle with portion control, especially in an era where plates have been getting bigger over time. In the 1960s, the average dinner plate was about 9 inches in diameter. Today, it's closer to 12 inches. That's a 33% increase, meaning that a standard portion now looks smaller than it used to, tricking people into eating more to compensate. Restaurants, whether intentionally or unintentionally, have weaponized this illusion. A dish served on a large plate appears smaller, making customers feel like they need more food to feel full. This leads to larger portion sizes, which then increase consumption. And because our brains struggle to perceive volume accurately, we end up underestimating how much we eat. Even high-end restaurants use this principle in reverse. By serving gourmet dishes on smaller plates, they make portions look more generous and satisfying than they actually are. But the Delboeuf Illusion doesn't just affect eating. It has broader implications for human perception. Studies have shown that the illusion can influence medical decisions. When doctors are given visual representations of medication doses, their perception of quantity can be manipulated by the surrounding space, sometimes leading to errors in prescribing. It also affects design and marketing. Brands use relative size contrast to make products appear larger or smaller than they actually are, whether it's a phone screen, a food package, or even a clothing size. So, how can we fight back against the Delboeuf Illusion? One of the most effective strategies is plate control. If you want to eat less without feeling deprived, use smaller plates. Studies show that switching from a 12-inch plate to a 9-inch plate can reduce calorie intake by up to 22%, without making people feel like they're eating less. Another method is to be conscious of serving sizes. Instead of relying on visual cues, measure portions based on actual volume. Because once you're aware that your brain is playing tricks on you, you can start making choices based on reality, not illusion. But here's the deeper question. If a simple optical illusion can influence how much we eat, what else in our daily lives is being manipulated by perception? What if our decisions, habits, and even beliefs are shaped by subtle distortions we don't even notice? Because if something as basic as a plate can change the way we consume food, what else is shaping our reality without us realizing it? The false consensus effect. Imagine you're in a heated debate, certain that your opinion is the most logical, the most reasonable, because everyone you know agrees with you. You scroll through social media, see posts reinforcing your beliefs, and assume that the majority of people must think the same way. But what if you're wrong? What if the world outside your bubble is completely different? What if your certainty is an illusion, a cognitive bias warping your perception of reality? This is the false consensus effect, a psychological trap that makes people overestimate how many others share their opinions, beliefs, and experiences. It's the reason why polarization is growing. Misinformation spreads like wildfire, and societies fracture into echo chambers. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias that convinces people their opinions are more common than they actually are. It makes us believe that our way of thinking is the default, that those who disagree are just a small, misguided minority. And the more we fall into this trap, the harder it becomes to see the world as it truly is. Psychologists first uncovered this bias in the 1970s when they conducted a simple experiment. Participants were given a moral dilemma, whether or not to break a law in a certain situation. After making their decision, they were asked to guess what others would do. The results? No matter what choice people made, they assumed most others would agree with them. Those who broke the law believed most people would have done the same. Those who followed the rules thought the majority would too. This bias isn't just about opinions. It's about perception. It distorts reality, making us believe that what we think is not just our own belief, but the way things actually are. And this effect has devastating consequences. In politics, the false consensus effect creates division. People assume that their political views are widely shared, and when they encounter those who disagree, they see them as outliers, extremists, or simply uninformed. This makes compromise nearly impossible, because if you believe the majority is already on your side, why would you ever change your mind? This is why social media amplifies this bias to dangerous levels. The algorithms behind platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok prioritize engagement, meaning they show you content you are more likely to interact with. Over time, this creates an echo chamber, a digital world where you're constantly surrounded by people who think like you, reinforcing the illusion that your perspective is the dominant one. And the more time we spend inside these bubbles, the more radicalized our thinking becomes. A chilling example of this is the anti-vaccine movement. Many people in these communities truly believe that most of the world is secretly against vaccines, that they are part of a hidden majority resisting a global conspiracy. Even though scientific evidence overwhelmingly supports vaccines, the false consensus effect convinces them that they are on the right side of history. The same phenomenon fuels flat Earth theories, climate change denial, and conspiracy groups. In every case, people believe their beliefs are widely shared, even when the facts say otherwise. But it's not just social media, It's everyday life. The false consensus effect is why people are shocked when an election doesn't go their way, even though half the country voted against them. It's why people assume their sense of humor is universal, only to be confused when others don't laugh. It's why those who cheat on tests, cut in traffic, or break minor laws think, everyone does this. But here's the scary part. This effect doesn't just distort reality, it creates it. When people believe their opinions are more common than they are, they become more vocal, more aggressive, and more willing to act on those beliefs. If someone falsely believes most people think like them, they feel justified in silencing opposition. This is how radical movements gain power, how cults grow, and how authoritarianism takes root. And this isn't just speculation. History is filled with examples of entire societies trapped in the false consensus effect. During the rise of Nazi Germany, many Germans believed they were part of an overwhelming majority that supported Hitler's ideology, even when millions quietly opposed it. Those who disagreed stayed silent, believing they were alone. And in their silence, the illusion of consensus became reality. This is why the false consensus effect is so dangerous. It doesn't just convince people that they are right, it convinces them that everyone else already agrees. And that belief, unchecked, leads to extremism, misinformation, and the erosion of truth itself. So, how do we break free? How do we escape the illusion of consensus? The answer is doubt. We must constantly question our own assumptions. We must seek out opposing views, not to argue, but to understand. We must recognize that our experiences are not universal, and that the world is far more complex than we assume. Because the truth is, most people don't think exactly like you. And once you realize that, you don't just see the world differently, you see it more clearly. The anchoring bias. The anchoring bias is one of the most powerful and dangerous psychological tricks our minds play on us. It is a cognitive illusion that influences the way we make decisions, shape opinions, and even perceive reality itself. It is so subtle, so deeply embedded in our thinking, that most people have no idea they are being manipulated by it. And yet, it controls everything from the way we shop to the way we vote, to the way we judge the value of things in our daily lives. Here's how it works. When we are given a number, even one that is completely irrelevant, it acts as an anchor, pulling our judgment toward it. Once that number is in our minds, our brains unconsciously use it as a reference point, even if it has nothing to do with the decision we're making. Imagine this experiment. Researchers asked two groups of people the same question. How many African nations are in the United Nations? But before answering, the first group was told to consider the number 10, and the second group was told to consider the number 65. The result? The group that saw the number 10 guessed a much lower number than the group that saw 65. The number they had seen moments before, a number that had nothing to do with the question, had anchored their minds and pulled their guesses toward it. This effect has been tested and proven in countless experiments. In one study, researchers spun a roulette wheel with numbers between 0 and 100. Then, they asked participants, what percentage of the United Nations is made up of African countries? Here's the catch. The roulette wheel was rigged. Half the participants saw the wheel stop on 10, and the other half saw it stop on 65. The results were shocking. The group that saw the wheel land on 10 estimated the percentage to be around 25%. The group that saw the wheel land on 65 estimated the percentage to be around 45%. A random, meaningless number had completely changed how people perceived reality. And this doesn't just happen in experiments, it happens every single day in real life. Think about shopping. When you see a product that was originally priced at $500 but is now on sale for $300, it feels like a great deal. Why? Because your brain has anchored itself to the first number you saw, the higher price. But was that product ever really worth $500? Or was the high price just placed there to manipulate your perception? This is why real estate agents show you the most expensive houses first. If the first house you see is a $2 million mansion, then a $600,000 house suddenly feels cheap in comparison. But if you had seen a $200,000 house first, that same $600,000 house would feel ridiculously expensive. The house didn't change, your perception did. This is why car salesmen always start with the highest price options. If they first show you a model that costs $50,000, then when they offer you a car for $40,000, it feels like a bargain. even if you originally only intended to spend $30,000. And this isn't just about money, it affects our judgment of people as well. Imagine a courtroom. Two criminals are on trial for similar crimes. The first criminal is sentenced to 20 years in prison. Later, when the second criminal is sentenced, the judge, without realizing it, is anchored by that 20-year sentence. So, instead of independently evaluating the crime, they might subconsciously adjust their decision based on the first number they saw. This is why first impressions matter so much. If someone introduces you to a new person by saying, "He's really smart," your brain anchors itself to that idea. Even if you later see evidence that contradicts it, your mind will still lean toward that initial impression. The anchoring bias is so powerful that it even distorts our sense of morality. Studies have shown that when people are asked whether they would donate $10,000 to charity, they say it's too much. But if you ask them whether they would donate $50, then suddenly $10,000 feels like an extreme number. The anchor affects how we perceive generosity. And it goes even deeper. In one study, two groups of participants were asked to estimate Gandhi's age at death. One group was asked, did Gandhi die before or after the age of 9? The other group was asked, did Gandhi die before or after the age of 140? Obviously, both numbers are ridiculous. Gandhi didn't die at either 9 or 140, but despite that, their final estimates were pulled toward the anchors they had seen. The group given the number 9 guessed much lower, while the group given 140 guessed much higher. This is how news, propaganda, and medias influence public opinion. When a government, a corporation, or a media outlet wants to manipulate perception, they don't need to lie, they just need to introduce an anchor. If they want you to believe that a new tax increase is small, they first mention a much higher tax rate that never actually happens. Suddenly, the real increase seems reasonable. If they want a political candidate to seem less extreme, they compare them to someone even more extreme. If they want to make a crime rate seem low, they first show a statistic about a place with an even higher crime rate. Our brains do not judge numbers in isolation. We judge them relative to the first number we see. So how do we fight this? The first step is awareness. The next time you are given a number, whether it's a price, a statistic, or an opinion, ask yourself, is this number actually meaningful, or is it just an anchor? Second, reframe the question. Instead of judging something based on the first number you see, take a step back. Look at the full picture. If a store says, originally $500, now $300, ignore the $500. Ask yourself, would I pay $300 for this if I had never seen the first price? Finally, question how numbers are being used in arguments, media, and sales tactics. If something feels like a great deal or a reasonable decision, ask, is it actually reasonable? Or have I just been anchored into believing it is? Because at the end of the day, the anchoring bias isn't just a small mental trick. It is a fundamental flaw in how we perceive reality. And if you don't control it, someone else will control you. The mere exposure effect. Imagine hearing a song on the radio for the first time. You don't think much of it. Maybe you even dislike it. But then you hear it again and again. Suddenly, weeks later, you find yourself humming the tune, maybe even enjoying it. You never chose to like it, but somehow it grew on you. This is the mere exposure effect, one of the most subtle yet powerful psychological forces that shape our preferences, emotions, and even our deepest beliefs. It's the reason why repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds affection, even when we aren't aware of it. It affects everything, from the ads you see, the songs you like, the people you trust, and even the opinions you hold. It's why political campaigns flood the airwaves, why brands repeat their slogans endlessly, and why the things we see most often feel right to us, even if they shouldn't. But how does it work? And more importantly, how does it manipulate us without us realizing it? To understand the mere exposure effect, we have to go back to 1968, when psychologist Robert Zeigarnik conducted a groundbreaking experiment. He showed participants a series of completely meaningless symbols, random Chinese characters, unfamiliar words, and strange geometric shapes. Some symbols were shown only once, while others appeared multiple times throughout the study. Then, participants were asked a simple question: which symbols do you like the most? The results were shocking. People consistently preferred the symbols they had seen more often, even though they had no idea what they meant. Zeigarnik's conclusion: The more we are exposed to something, the more we tend to like it, simply because it becomes familiar. And this bias extends far beyond meaningless symbols. It's hardwired into every aspect of human perception. Think about how this plays out in your daily life. Have you ever noticed that you start liking a brand, a celebrity, or even a stranger just because you see them often? That's not an accident. It's the mere exposure effect in action. This is why advertising works. Companies don't just show you a product once and hope you buy it. They bombard you on billboards, YouTube ads, TV commercials, social media feeds. At first you might ignore it. But after the 10th time seeing that same ad, you start thinking, maybe this brand is good. Maybe this product is worth trying. You didn't arrive at this conclusion rationally. You were conditioned to feel that way. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. The mere exposure effect doesn't just shape our preferences. It shapes our beliefs. In 1977, researchers found that people who saw fake news headlines multiple times were more likely to believe them, regardless of whether they were true or false. The reason? Familiarity feels like truth. When you hear something over and over again, your brain stops questioning it. Instead of evaluating whether something is actually correct, we mistake recognition for accuracy. It's why propaganda is so effective. Why political slogans are repeated endlessly. Why misinformation, even when debunked, still lingers in people's minds. The more we are exposed to an idea, the more real it feels, even if it's completely false. And this doesn't just apply to words or messages. It applies to people. Studies show that the more often you see someone's face, the more trustworthy and likable they appear. This is why politicians put their faces on billboards, why celebrities become icons, and why familiar people feel safer than strangers, even if we don't actually know them. The mere exposure effect is also one of the reasons why nostalgia is so powerful. The movies, songs, and fashion from your childhood feel better than new things, not because they're superior, but because they are familiar. It also explains why change feels uncomfortable. We resist new ideas, new cultures, new technology, not necessarily because they're bad, but because they're unfamiliar. Our brains are wired to trust what we've already seen, even when what we've already seen isn't the best option. But here's the most disturbing part. If repetition can make us like things, what else is being implanted into our minds without our awareness? If exposure alone can make us believe a lie, trust a brand, or even love a song we once hated, then how much of our perception of the world is truly our own choice? And more importantly, who is deciding what we are exposed to? Think about social media algorithms. They aren't just showing you random content. They intentionally repeat certain ideas, certain headlines, certain faces, shaping what you like, what you trust, and what you think is real. The news you consume, the brands you recognize, the politicians you favor. Are these truly your choices? Or have they simply been shown to you enough times that your brain accepted them without question? The next time you catch yourself liking something without knowing why, ask yourself, do I like this because it's good? Or do I like it because I've seen it so many times that I think it's good? The Pratfall Effect. Imagine watching a brilliant public speaker perfectly delivering their message, articulate, confident, flawless. But then, just as they finish, they spill their coffee on their shirt. The audience laughs, not out of cruelty, but because at that moment, they feel connected to them. This is the Pratfall Effect, a strange psychological phenomenon that proves making small mistakes can actually make people more likable, as long as they are already competent. At first, this sounds counterintuitive. We assume that perfection is what makes someone admirable, that the fewer mistakes a person makes, the more respected they will be. But the truth is, flawlessness can create distance. It makes people seem unreachable, intimidating, almost inhuman. But a tiny, relatable mistake, that's what makes them real. The Pratfall Effect was first studied by psychologist Elliot Aronson in the 1960s. In his experiment, participants listened to two different recordings of a person answering quiz questions. In the first version, the person answered almost everything correctly, sounding intelligent and impressive. In the second version, the same person answered the questions just as well, but at the end, they clumsily spilled coffee. The result? The person who made the small mistake was rated as far more likable. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The effect only works if the person is already seen as competent. If someone who is already struggling or unskilled makes a mistake, it doesn't make them more likable. It just reinforces their incompetence. But when someone who is clearly capable, intelligent, or skilled makes a minor blunder, it makes them appear more relatable, more human, and more likable. And this effect is everywhere. Think about celebrities, the ones who seem perfect, untouchable, flawless. They're admired, but often at a distance. But the moment a famous actor trips on the red carpet, forgets a word in an interview, or laughs at their own mistake, they instantly become more lovable. It's why people love bloopers in movies. Seeing actors break character, mess up lines, or burst into laughter makes them feel more real and more likable. And this goes beyond entertainment. Presidents, CEOs, and public figures all carefully manage their image, but some of the most popular leaders in history were those who weren't afraid to be a little clumsy. Consider John F. Kennedy. He was charismatic, intelligent, and respected. But people loved him even more when he joked about his own mistakes, laughed at his mispronunciations, and openly admitted when he messed up. Now, compare that to politicians who seem too polished, too rehearsed, too scripted. They struggle to connect with people. Because deep down, we don't trust perfection. We trust humanity. And it's not just about leaders, it's about everyday life. Have you ever been in a situation where someone accidentally dropped something, made a silly joke, or tripped slightly, only to find that it actually made them more charming? That's the Pratfall Effect in action. It's the reason why the clumsy but lovable character trope exists in movies, why people adore imperfect, self-deprecating humor, why a small mistake in a job interview doesn't necessarily ruin your chances. In fact, it might help. Because making a tiny, relatable mistake signals something deeper. It shows that you're not trying to be perfect, and that makes you safe, trustworthy, and real. But here's the catch. This effect can't be faked. If someone tries to make mistakes on purpose to seem more likable, it backfires. It looks calculated, manipulative, and inauthentic. People can sense when something isn't real. The Pratfall Effect works only when the mistake is genuine, when someone is already skilled, confident, and competent, and their flaws simply happen naturally. And this raises an important question. How much pressure do we put on ourselves to be perfect? In school, at work, in relationships, we are terrified of making mistakes. We think that one slip-up, one misstep, one awkward moment will ruin everything. But the truth is, perfection isn't what makes people love you. It's your flaws, your quirks, your moments of clumsiness. Because when people see you mess up just a little, they don't judge you. They see themselves in you. So the next time you spill your drink, forget a word, or trip over nothing. Don't be embarrassed. It might just make you more likable. And maybe, just maybe, you don't have to be perfect to be unforgettable. The Bystander Effect. The Bystander Effect is one of the most disturbing and deeply unsettling flaws in human psychology. It is proof that in moments of crisis, when someone needs help the most, the presence of others can paradoxically lead to inaction. It is the reason people can witness a crime, a violent assault, even a murder, and do nothing. Not because they are cruel or indifferent, but because their minds are trapped in a psychological illusion. The more people that are present, the less likely any one person is to intervene. Everyone assumes that someone else will step in, so no one does. This phenomenon was first identified after a tragedy that shook the world. In 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was brutally attacked outside her apartment in New York City. She screamed for help. She pleaded for someone to save her. And yet, dozens of witnesses heard her cries and did nothing. No one called the police. No one ran to stop the attacker. They all assumed that someone else would act. They were wrong. Kitty Genovese died that night, and her murder became one of the most infamous examples of the bystander effect in history. But it was not an isolated case. It was simply the first to expose an unsettling truth about human behavior. When responsibility is shared, people feel less responsible. Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané wanted to understand this disturbing tendency. So, they designed an experiment that would forever change how we see human nature. Participants were placed in a room and told they would be communicating with others via an intercom. Then, during the conversation, they heard someone having a seizure over the intercom. Their voice choked. They gasped for air. They pleaded for help. The participant believed they were the only one who could hear the emergency. In that scenario, 85% of participants rushed to help. But then the experiment changed. This time, participants were led to believe that several other people were also hearing the seizure. Now, the number of people who helped dropped to just 31%. The larger the group, the more people froze, waiting for someone else to act. This is the terrifying power of the bystander effect. In situations where action is needed, the presence of others creates diffusion of responsibility. People hesitate. They look around, waiting to see if someone else will take the first step. And as everyone hesitates, nothing happens. And this effect isn't just seen in emergencies, it's everywhere. Think about public spaces. You see someone collapsed on the street. A homeless person clearly in distress. A child wandering alone, looking scared. The instinctive thought isn't always "I should help." It's "someone else will handle it." Think about bullying. In schools, countless students witness acts of bullying but say nothing. Not because they don't care, but because they assume someone else will stand up. Think about online harassment. A person is being attacked in the comments, receiving threats, being humiliated in front of thousands. People scroll past, they watch, but most won't intervene. Why? Because they believe someone else will defend them. The bystander effect is not just about inaction, it's about lost moments of intervention. It's about the seconds that could have saved a life, the small actions that could have prevented a tragedy, the choice to step forward when everyone else remains frozen. But here's the part that should truly scare you. The bystander effect applies to you. If you believe that you would act differently in a crisis, ask yourself, have you ever hesitated? Have you ever waited to see if someone else would step in first? That moment of hesitation, that's the bystander effect at work. But here's the good news. It can be broken. Studies have shown that when just one person steps forward, others are far more likely to follow. Courage is contagious. The first person to act shatters the illusion of shared responsibility, and suddenly, the group wakes up. The key is recognizing the effect in real time. The next time you witness something that demands action, don't wait. Don't look around to see if someone else will act. Be the one who moves first. If Kitty Genovese had just one person who ran to her, the outcome might have been different. If one person had called the police earlier, she might have survived. But instead, the world watched and did nothing. So the next time you are in a situation where help is needed, remember this moment. Remember that hesitation is the enemy, that silence can be deadly, and that your single action, the choice to step forward, could change everything. The serial position effect. Imagine walking into a room full of strangers. You're introduced to 10 people, one after another. Hours later, you try to recall their names. Strangely, you clearly remember the names of the first and last people you met. But the ones in the middle? Gone. Blurry. Almost impossible to recall. This isn't just forgetfulness. It's a flaw in the way our brains process information. It's called the serial position effect, and it dictates what we remember, what we forget, and how information is strategically placed to manipulate us. This effect is why politicians repeat key phrases at the beginning and end of their speeches, why advertisers put the most critical details at the start and finish of a commercial, why, even in storytelling, the opening and closing scenes hold the most weight, because the brain isn't a perfect recording device. It doesn't store everything equally. It prioritizes certain moments while discarding others. But why? And more importantly, how is this being used to control what we remember and what we forget? The serial position effect was first discovered by psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus in the late 1800s. He conducted a series of memory experiments where participants were given long lists of random words. After studying them, they were asked to recall as many as they could. The results? People consistently remembered the words at the beginning and the end of the list, while the words in the middle were mostly forgotten. Ebbinghaus identified two forces at work: the primacy effect. The first things we hear stick better because our brains attach importance to them. They become the foundation upon which all later information is built. The recency effect. The last things we hear are fresh in our short-term memory, making them easier to recall immediately afterward. But the middle? It's overwritten, lost in the noise, easily forgotten. Now, think about how this shapes your daily life. Have you ever watched a commercial where the most important message is repeated at the very beginning and very end? That's no accident. Advertisers know that your brain will latch on to those parts while forgetting the filler in the middle. Have you ever noticed that politicians open and close their speeches with powerful slogans and emotional appeals? That's because they know you'll walk away remembering those key moments, even if everything in between was forgettable. This effect isn't just used in marketing and politics. It controls how we experience entertainment, education, and even conversations. Think about movies. The most iconic scenes are usually at the beginning or end, the shocking first moments, or the unforgettable final act. The parts in between, they blend together. Think about job interviews. First impressions matter. The way you introduce yourself can define the entire interaction, and at the end, a strong closing remark can leave a lasting impression, even if you stumbled in the middle. The serial position effect is so deeply ingrained in human memory that it even affects how we remember relationships. Studies show that when people reflect on past relationships, they tend to remember how they started and how they ended, while the everyday moments in between become a blur. This is why breakups and final conversations feel so much more significant. They're locked into our memory while everything else fades. But here's the darker side of this effect. If people only remember the beginning and end of an experience, what happens when that knowledge is exploited? Think about how history is written. Events that are placed at the beginning and end of a historical narrative become the most remembered, shaping public perception while details in the middle get erased. Think about how news headlines work. The first line and the final line of an article shape what most people take away, even if the full story tells something completely different. And perhaps the most unsettling example? Misinformation. Studies show that when false information is placed at the beginning or end of a statement, it's more likely to be believed and remembered, even if the truth is buried somewhere in the middle. So what can we do to protect ourselves from being manipulated by the serial position effect? The first step is awareness. Now that you know about it, you can start paying attention to where information is being placed. If you're watching a political debate, ask yourself, are they putting their strongest claims at the start and finish to make you forget the weaker parts in between? If you're absorbing information from an article, go beyond the headline. The most critical facts might be buried in the middle. If you're listening to an argument, don't just remember the first and last point. Force yourself to focus on the details in between. And perhaps most importantly, if you ever feel like you're remembering something too easily, ask yourself, is this because it's true? Or is it just because it was strategically placed where my brain would latch onto it? Because if we aren't careful, we don't just risk forgetting the middle of a sentence. We risk forgetting the middle of the truth itself. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, frequency illusion. Imagine learning a new word for the first time, maybe something unusual like apophenia. You've never heard it before, and then suddenly you see it everywhere. It's in a book you're reading, someone mentions it in a conversation, and you even spot it on a random website the next day. Or maybe you're thinking about buying a new car, and suddenly that exact model seems to appear on every street, parked in every lot, and flashing by you on the highway. At first, it feels like some kind of strange coincidence, as if the universe is sending you a message, but it's not. This is the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as the frequency illusion, one of the strangest cognitive biases that tricks your brain into believing something rare has suddenly become common. But why does this happen? Why does the moment you notice something for the first time, it suddenly feels like it's everywhere? The answer lies in how your brain processes reality. Every single day, you are bombarded with an overwhelming amount of information. Millions of sights, sounds, words, and experiences flood your senses, but you can't process all of it. You don't even notice 99% of what's happening around you. Your brain acts as a filter, deciding what's important and what can be ignored. Most things blend into the background until something grabs your attention. And the moment your brain labels something as important, it starts actively searching for it, without you even realizing. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon happens in two parts. First is selective attention. The second you learn something new, your brain marks it as relevant, making you more likely to notice it in the future. Second is confirmation bias. Once you start noticing something more, your brain convinces you that it must be appearing more often. But in reality, it was always there. You just never noticed. This effect is so powerful that it can change how we see the world. Think about a time when you were in love. Suddenly it felt like every song on the radio was about romance, every movie had a love story, and every conversation seemed to mention relationships. Or, after a breakup, Every sad song felt personal, and reminders of your past seemed to appear everywhere. That's the frequency illusion at work. Your emotions prime your brain to spot patterns that reinforce your reality. And it's not just personal experiences. Entire societies are shaped by this illusion. Ever noticed how, after a big news event, suddenly everyone is talking about it? After a major crime, similar crimes seem to be reported everywhere. After a viral conspiracy theory, people start seeing evidence all around them. The more people notice something, the more others start noticing it too. This is why people falsely believe that the world is becoming more dangerous, even when crime rates are falling. The more we hear about something, the more we assume it's happening everywhere. And this illusion can be exploited. Marketing, politics, and media use the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon to control what you pay attention to. Advertisers show you a product once, knowing that if it catches your interest, you'll start seeing it everywhere. That's why, after searching for a product online, it seems to follow you across the internet. Politicians use fear to make problems seem bigger than they are. Once they tell you to look for something, crime, corruption, a specific enemy, your brain will start finding examples everywhere, reinforcing their message. And misinformation? It thrives on this effect. Once you hear a false fact, your brain starts searching for things that confirm it, even if it was never true to begin with. This is how paranoia spreads. This is how superstitions are born. And this is how people end up believing in patterns that don't actually exist. The scariest part? The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon can make people believe reality itself is changing, even when nothing has changed at all. So, how do we break free? How do we stop our own brains from tricking us? The first step is awareness. Understanding that just because you're noticing something more doesn't mean it's happening more. The second step is critical thinking. When you feel like something is suddenly everywhere, ask yourself, was it always there, and I just never noticed? And the last step? Control your focus. Because the truth is, you don't see the world as it is. You see what your brain chooses to notice, and once you realize that, you can start choosing what to see. The just world fallacy. The just world fallacy is one of the most disturbing illusions in human psychology. It is the belief that the world is inherently fair, that good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. It is comforting, it is reassuring, and it is a lie. This illusion is so deeply ingrained in our minds that when faced with cruelty, injustice, and suffering, many people refuse to accept the randomness of life. Instead, they try to rationalize it. They search for reasons why the victim must have deserved what happened to them. Not because they are cruel, but because their minds cannot handle a world where terrible things happen for no reason. This is why people blame victims. When someone is assaulted, robbed, or harmed, we hear, well, why were they out so late? What were they wearing? They should have been more careful. Instead of confronting the terrifying truth that violence and misfortune can strike anyone at any time, people convince themselves that the victim must have done something wrong. This is why when people see poverty, they assume they must be lazy. They should have worked harder. It is easier to believe that they brought it on themselves than to accept that circumstances, privilege, and luck play massive roles in success or failure. The just world fallacy is the reason some people feel no sympathy for refugees fleeing war, assuming they must have done something to deserve this. It's why some blame people suffering from illness, saying they should have taken better care of themselves. It's why people watching a tragic accident immediately look for ways to distance themselves from the victim, thinking, that would never happen to me. I wouldn't have made that mistake. This illusion has been tested and proven in psychological studies. In one experiment, researchers showed participants two versions of the same story. A woman goes on a date. She enjoys the evening. In one version, the date ends with a friendly goodbye. In the second version, the man assaults her. Shockingly, when participants read the second version, they were more likely to blame the woman for what happened. They searched for flaws in her behavior, convincing themselves that she must have done something wrong. The only difference was the outcome, yet people's minds twisted the facts to make the world seem fair. This is why, after a disaster, whether it's an earthquake, a terrorist attack, or a mass shooting, some people say, God must be punishing them for something. They cannot accept that suffering is random, so they invent a reason that makes it seem like justice was served. But here's the horrifying truth. The world is not fair. People are not always punished for their cruelty. Good people are not always rewarded. Innocent people suffer every single day for no reason at all. This fallacy is dangerous because it leads to apathy. If people convince themselves that every victim must have deserved their fate, they feel no responsibility to help. It justifies indifference, it allows injustice to continue, and it blinds people to systemic problems that need to be fixed. The just world fallacy is why people resist the idea of privilege. If they admit that some people are born with advantages that others don't have, it forces them to confront the unfairness of reality. Instead, they prefer to believe that everyone gets what they deserve, even when that is clearly not true. So, how do we fight this illusion? The first step is awareness. Recognize that when something terrible happens to someone, your instinct might be to look for reasons why they were responsible. Challenge that instinct. Ask yourself, am I blaming the victim just to make myself feel safer? The second step is empathy. Instead of searching for reasons why a person deserves their suffering, ask, how can I help? How can we change the system that allows this to happen? The world is not just. But that does not mean we should accept injustice. Once we break free from the just world fallacy, we can stop making excuses, stop ignoring suffering, and start working toward a world where fairness is not just an illusion, but a reality we create.